Hey, welcome back to the Métropole Grid. My name is Andre. Thanks so much for tuning in. And today I'm joined by Ysengrin, or you might know as Jeff. How's it going, Jeff?
It's going great. Thanks for having me back on.
Yeah, and this is part two of our second part of the whole Borealis cycle. But this is our set review, our set tier list of Parhelion, a set that has just come out about, at this point, it's like 5 days ago. So this is pretty early impressions when it comes to the cards. So firstly, part one of this video, which is the corp side of stuff, that's all already up on Jeff's channel on YsengrinSC on YouTube. There should be a link down there below, so go check that out. This is part two. And just to describe what we're doing, it's like 5 days since the release of the set. It's worth mentioning, Jeff, you have playtested these cards, so I think you have a bit more experience with these things.
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. I think one thing I got very humbled by is how much playtesting doesn't resemble actual in-practice play, but I've definitely played with these cards a little bit more.
Okay, yeah, but that's really exciting. I do think that it gives another view into what these cards might be able to, what you might be able to do with them. But yeah, the set's only been out for a while. A lot of these cards, I don't think I've actually played myself. I have tried a whole bunch of them, but we're going to be talking about mostly standard competitive Netrunners. So what we think at the top tables of very high skill level organized play, how these cards are going to match up in our tier list. We will be shouting up Startup when it is kind of pertinent, and there are some good startup shoutouts. Startup right now is actually quite fascinating with the big rotation. But that should be it. Want to explain, Jeff, real quickly our 5 categories we've been using for our tier lists?
Yeah, so these categories are meant to be generally kind of power level, but there's definitely cards and ideas in them that mean that it's not strictly a power level. The highest level category is ban me please. And this category isn't cards that we're saying, oh, please ban these on release. But these are cards that are so powerful, they're going to probably be meta and game defining, and will probably be flirting with the ban list at times. We have Faction Staple as the next category. These are cards, generally, they're going to be very powerful, but sometimes they're just like an essential piece of economy or part of a runner's toolkit, and you're just going to see them in basically every game if you're playing up against that faction, or sometimes, I'm going to wager, even beyond that faction.
Yeah, I think Steelskin Scarring was the big shout out from the previous set. It's not the most powerful card in the deck, but it's a card that you're going to see in almost every Anarch deck going forward because it's just that good and that consistent. So yeah, there's a lot of staples. They're quite good.
Yeah. Next up, we have Archetype Role Player. These cards can be more powerful than faction staples, but they tend to be fit in only a certain subset of runner decks. Sometimes if that archetype takes over the full meta, you're going to see this card everywhere and it's going to completely dominate. But generally, they're a little bit more niche than cards that are in faction staple.
Speaking of niche, huh?
Speaking of, yeah, niche, these are cards that really are like you're only going to play them in a very specific meta. So generally these cards are pretty difficult to put in your deck, but in the last cycle we also put cards like No Free Lunch and Stone Ship Chart Room, which ended up being in basically every competitive deck. And those are meta dependent cards. They don't do a lot on their own, but we're pretty essential to the runner side in at least competitive standard play.
Yeah, there's some of the best cards end up in niche, and the certain metas really elevate them. And yeah, we saw our calls on this last set. You know, that did change a lot.
And finally, we have Shame. These are cards that you probably shouldn't put in your deck if you're going to try and go and win something, but they can be really interesting cards and really fun ones in their own right. So.
Yeah, Shame's a bit ironic. Some of our favorite cards end up in Shame, unfortunately, but it's yeah, it's not the best stuff that you're expecting to see at top tables.
I think both last time we put one of our, maybe not one of our favorite, but a card we both really liked in the Shame category just for its competitive ranking, not because the card has any negative connotations associated with it.
And right before we jump in, there's just 2 quick things. Firstly, we'll be reorganizing this list as we go, but it goes from left to right, top to bottom. So the leftmost card in the archetype role player should be the strongest archetype role player card. And then also, hopefully, and we did this for Midnight Sun, in about a month, maybe after these cards see a bit more organized play and you see some of the big test groups get some deck building in, we'll probably revisit this list and see how correct we were or how wrong we were. It's generally good fun regardless. And with that note, should we jump in?
Yeah, let's do it.
Let's start with our first Anarch card. This is Katurga Breakout. It's a run event. It costs 2. It's 3 influence, which is a fair bit. And it says run any server. If that run is successful, add 1 card from your heap to your grip. So this is a recursion card, which is a really interesting thing in Netrunner. It's an interesting thing in card games as a whole, as something that can be problematic. Recursion, if it's too powerful, if it's too prevalent, that's kind of an issue in a lot of card games, a real big sticking point. In fact, recently on the corp side, 2 of the big recursion cards in the standard format recently got banned. Now, this is interesting because we've seen Anarch basic blanket recursion, and this is the first blanket runner recursion card that's really easy to play that we've seen in a really long time. Do you think this will see play, though?
I think that's a really interesting question because it's hard to imagine exactly what deck this fits in, but it's also one of those cards where it's like as soon as someone figures out how this puts their whole engine together, it's just going to break the game wide open.
Yep.
Um, I think it's interesting the different uses of recursion for corp versus runner side. And runner side recursion is a little bit more, I'm going to call it like traditional card game recursion, where it's mostly about I have really powerful cards and I want to play that really powerful card a bunch of times. And the biggest challenge to this card right now is compared to older metas, there's not that many single use cards in Netrunner that you're like, oh yes, I'm super excited to get to pull this out of my heap and play it again.
Yes.
Yeah, we're not in a world of account siphon anymore. We're in a world of diversion of funds, which is just both less splashable and less impactful.
That's like such a big point here is in Netrunner, the history of Netrunner, when recursion cards have been staples of runner play, it's usually because there's another card or series of cards that are just kind of way overtuned and are just way over budget. And so the optimal first order, optimal strategy for a lot of those runner decks is just to play that card as many times as you can. Even if it's a super inefficient way to recur the card, sometimes it's worth it. And while back in the day, if you played account siphon spam decks or blackmail spam decks, you probably remember that and probably don't think fondly of it. And I feel like right now there's nothing that obviously fits that camp, which is kind of makes this a really fascinating card. Is this actually fair recursion?
Yeah, I think it's some interesting things to note. This doesn't, if you wanted to make a run on that server already, this doesn't take away the access. It's just if the run is successful. So to some extent, this can be 2-credit clickless recursion in the best possible case.
Yeah, and I think the 2-credit thing on this is like kind of clumsy, right? It makes it quite expensive. And I do think one of the natural candidates for this deck is a deck that's playing something like Ghost Tongue or a Mystic Miami. And those are decks that generally have an operation or excuse me, an event-based economy package. And with those decks, the fact that you can pay a credit maybe with Ghost Tongue to make a run and then basically draw a really good card. Like imagine this card costs 2 and it says make a run if successful, draw a card from your deck. That probably wouldn't be amazing, but the fact that you know what card you're drawing and it's probably one of the best cards in your deck actually makes it kind of reasonable. And if you're drawing another event, that's another thing that you can save a credit from and it really pushes your engine forward, your Ghost Tongue engine. You get more value every single turn. And that actually seems kind of okay, as long as, again, there's something really impactful. Maybe it's just economy, but maybe it's like massive multi-axis. Maybe it's Chastushka. I think that's another good candidate for this sort of thing.
Yeah, I think really when I'm looking at this, I'm looking for probably a high impact event in most cases. And so Chachushka is a good shout out. I think Deep Dive and Apocalypse are 2 other really important cards, especially because this can be one of the runs to pull those cards out of your bin if say you're playing up against a damage PE deck, or if you just draw them too early and you can say, you know what, rather than holding these for the whole game, I know I can discard it because I have the Katorka breakout for the rest of the game.
So that use case is the use case that a lot of people use labor rights, which is, again, a card that I think at some point has been banned and been unbanned, a very powerful card, but it has a different use case, which is generally you're at the end of your stack and then you're making sure your deck is everything you want to. And that's the sort of card a lot of times Anarchs would play if there's like a late game recursion piece they need. And it's interesting that this falls into a similar, a similar camp, but it's better on tempo by a mile.
Yeah,
sort of.
And this can also get used earlier in the game than labor rights can. Labor rights is often like a last third of the game, whereas this is probably active from the second third on, but recurs fewer cards. So it's sort of that and cost credits and stuff. So it's got like I think you're probably not going to run both of these in the deck, but I can see a meta where both of them see play.
It's weird. There's so many engine pieces from this set that I think kind of hinge or get so much better with Steelskin Scarring. I wonder if you play Ghost Tongue deck, if you're good enough just recurring to Steelskin Scarring and then getting that trash for free. Like that's really good tempo. Technically, it gets uglier when you have to play this card, but you know what I mean? There's like certain cards that are kind of, you feel good recurring. I wonder if Steelskin Scarring is good enough. It doesn't seem like it kind of seems like a hard sell.
Yeah, I think Steelskin Scarring on its own isn't enough, but maybe if you're playing this for 1 credit or 0 credits, then you start looking a little bit more reasonable and you're getting like there's definitely some kind of runner engine deck where this is part of like just a stack of effects that you get to put together. And I think we're going to talk about that a lot more as we get through some of the other cards in the set.
It's wild. It's 2022, almost 2023, and there's just like a blanket, the easiest recursion card, barring Deja Vu, and we're not very sold on it. It's strange what this game has become. What are we thinking about this thing? Like, I don't know if it's a role player, but I guess it technically is. It's just I don't think the archetype is possible.
Yeah, I would put this in role player. I think that's a very good definition. I would. That's the wrong card though,
Oh yeah, that's true.
because we're going in story order, not set
Yeah,
order.
that's true. Yeah.
It's like one of those cards where like I'm really leery on putting it low in archetype role player, just because like even if it's not nuts right now, it's gonna just get better over time. I think if the power level that I feel like we're seeing in Parhelion continues,
Yes.
I think we're in for some really spicy cards in the future.
I'd be surprised to see this card, but I know if I'm seeing it, there's probably something else again that's worth recurring. And I don't know if we have that now, but yeah, it's always going to be there. It's a card you're going to look for if there's something that's, quite powerful. Speaking about powerful events, we got Finality. 2-cost run events, same idea here. We got a lot of events in the set for Anarch. As additional cost to play this, you have to suffer a core damage. Generally, that's a bad thing, but Essa's on the art. Core damage is good for Essa. Run R&D, if successful, access 3 additional cards. So that's a 4-card access, Maker's Eye +1. A core damage is a cost. Again, if you're playing Essa, that's actually a kind of a nice thing because it's additional multi-access, additional disruption on top of this. This is a cool card. When I've been playing against Essa in like the Midnight Sun world, you worry about archives and the sabotage, but then you worry just about HQ, all right? Because it's just Dushkas are going to come down. But now actually Essa threatens every single central server actually pretty reasonably.
Yeah, I mean, this card is just straight gas. This is like, I think it makes me almost wonder if we've been undervaluing Maker's Eye.
Yeah.
But like I've been playing this, I've been talking with like really good players who are playing this, like, yeah, this card's just straight gas. And I think some of it is the additional access over Maker's Eye is a pretty significant improvement. And while a core damage, you don't want to take a ton of core damage, 1 or 2 is a pretty low cost in many senses, especially if you're playing this in Anarch, where you've got lots of cards you don't mind going into the bin anyway.
Do you think you can play this outside of Essa? Like, does this compete with Stargate, which has obviously been like a competitive staple, the way that interacts with so many of the factions? Can you just play this as, random multi-access card 2 to 5, or what are you thinking?
I think you probably can. Like I could imagine a freedom deck that's like, oh, I'm pressuring HQ, I'm pressuring HQ. Oh, the corpse locked up HQ. I'm going to finality, clear out agendas there, and then that buys me a couple of turns to set my engine, like, to catch it back up to the pace of the game, or to close out the game. And there's also, interestingly, this is credit positive in Zaya.
Oh wow, yeah, cool. I've never considered that. 3 influences a lot, but like that's only one more than Maker's Eye, and it's quite credit positive.
Yeah, you're making a run and making 2 credits and seeing 4 cards. Like if that's not enough tempo for you, I'm not sure what is. So
yeah, core damage is scary.
No, I think I think we'll see. I would not be surprised if we see some finality out of faction because it's a really impactful card. This is actually, I think, like a card you could recur with Katorga Breakout.
Yeah.
If the situation calls for it.
And maybe Katorga like works really well with Essa specifically, who, you might be losing cards to core damage in the early to mid game and being able to recur the cards. Maybe you lost a Chistushka too soon, like, or a finality. You can bring it back. I think that's cool. I do think a big shout out for this card is that multi-access in Anarch in startup is non-existent besides this card. Just because the twinning is really hard to use in faction and Stargate rotated. So this is actually kind of really good. And Essa in modern startup, I think is one of the most, exciting Anarchs to play.
I don't want us to get stuck on this card forever, but I just want to say this opens up like a whole new way kind of for runners to function because runners have basically been stuck in a Stargate lock. It's the best multi-access we have available. And so your runners then are like, okay, I need to make sure I can always play a start. Like I need to be able to set up my game plan to slap down a Stargate and lock down R&D forever. And this says, no, I don't need to just do a lock game. I can play games that are more about being responsive or sometimes pushing the tempo by playing a card like this. So I think that's interesting to see if that leads to any broader changes to the meta.
Yep, it's an exciting card. I do like Bush multi-access. I think we're saying this is a faction staple. That's kind of what it sounds like, huh?
Yeah, I could see an argument for putting it in. Well, I think it's probably preemptive to put this in Ban Me, Please. But no, this is definitely a faction staple.
We could address it later if we need to, but sick. Yeah, Anarchs. Good card so far. I really like this a lot. And we got another one. This is Raindrops Cut Stone. It's a run event for Anarch. Run any server. Whenever a subroutine resolves during that run, you get to put a power counter on this event. This is the first event I think that gets power counters. It's worth knowing it's not an installed card, so you can't charge it. So it's only going to do what it says it's going to do. And when the run ends, you draw 1 card for each host power counter on this, and then you also gain 3 credits. But it's worth noting the 3 credits is not attached to the power counters. It's always 3 credits floor. The card draw is the thing that scales up with power counters. This is a red Bravado. Bravado is good. Bravado is arguably too good, and seems clearly a bit worse than Bravado. You need to let the subroutines fire, and that's kind of the beauty of Bravado, is that even in the late game, it's like not bad. You could always play this to just gain 2 credits and draw a card as a run event. Like there's technically a floor that's not awful. This one's really hard to evaluate, and I think it attaches itself to some of the other cards we're going to see later in the set, where having subroutines fire is kind of the aim of the game, and it works really well with some of those. I don't really have a strong opinion on this thing. It's a card that I think ends up getting cut a lot. I don't know if it feels very good.
Yeah, I think to me, you really want to be playing this for 0 credits if you're going to be playing it at all. So just so that it becomes an easy mark with a run attached, and then in some board states, it's going to draw you a card, and then now you're looking at something that's like sure gamble plus value. But in a lot of board states, if you can't make a successful run, you don't want to make the run. And so just saying like, oh yeah, I'm going to play this, make 2 credits, and draw a card. It's a really tough card slot when you can moshing away 3 cards, draw 3 new ones, and make 3 credits.
Yeah.
So it's a little bit tricky to figure out exactly where this would fit in the generic Anarch deck, but I do suspect it's going to draw people It's not going to draw you no cards most of the time. It's probably drawing you, I would say, 1 card on almost any server you could want to run.
Yeah, there's like certain effects like this that are kind of dependent on the sort of ice you're expecting to see, right? Like if you're looking at cards like maybe, I don't know, what's a good example, Mouseless or Whoredom, right? These are Wayland cards that have a lot of subroutines, and you don't have to break all of them. And if you're seeing decks like that consistently, where there's like a subroutine or 2, maybe it's a trace that you're letting fire, like IP block gets eaten by this. And people love the idea of endless letting through this thing. You let the subroutines fire, you pay 6, you get some money back. But there are certain metas where like this card could actually be quite good and quite reasonable. How consistently are you hitting that? I honestly don't know. Like HB, this seems like a really hard thing to use, but it's mostly like Wayland and NBN. Jinteki, a lot of their subroutines are going to hurt you a bit bad too. And maybe this helps you redraw at least.
This feels like it was meant for a slot machine meta that it's never going to see.
Yeah, exactly. Which is a shame, right? Give me a lot of subs, please.
I think this card's pretty niche, but you know, it's cool, and the art is another banger from Scott.
Yeah, it's really good stuff. I do think this is a niche card. Again, I do think you're going to have to build into it, and we'll see the other support card for this, which I'm interested to hear what your thoughts are, Jeff. But yeah, it's definitely a trickier one to include. All right, we got an Anarch hardware. This is Time Bomb. It's unique. It only costs 1 credit. It's a weapon subtype. This makes it the 2nd weapon, if I'm not mistaken. Install only if you made a successful run on the central server, and when you install this, you put a power counter on it. At the start of every turn, it gets more power counters on it. At the start of your turn, if it already had 3, it explodes into Sabotage 3. It's also 3 influence, and art's fun. This is cool. Like, so there's a huge continuation. We saw so many sub themes that were introduced for the first time in Midnight Sun, right? Sabotage was the big Anarch thing, and now we're seeing actually way more Sabotage cards than I expected to see in this set. And these are very powerful Sabotage cards. Sabotage is a mechanic. If you don't know, the Corp has to trash an equal amount of cards, either from HQ or from the top of R&D, not knowing what they are. And Sabotage, we mentioned this before when we first talked about Midnight Sun, is that it's an effect that scales up not so much linearly, but kind of exponentially. The more Sabotage you can do either consistently turn over turn, or the more you can do in a single turn, the better it is. And this is very broadcast. Like the corporation can see this coming from a mile away. That still makes it hard to interact with. But the fact that you can sync up like a Time Bomb into a Chestushka with some of the other cards we're going to talk about today, like there's decks that can reasonably Sabotage consistently 12 to 15 cards in a game, and not in a really slow way either.
Yeah, I think it's when this card was released, someone was like, oh man, it's going to be completely broken. Anarch can install this 6 times now, just like with Katorga Breakout and Time Bomb, and they'll mill 18, which gives them a 50-50 chance of winning the game. And I'm like, yeah. I mean, that's technically true, but also that because it's unique, that's going to take them 18 turns. So it's not, I'm not like panicking about that game plan yet. But as you're talking about, there's a lot of compression. And I think one of the interesting things is that while the Corp can plan for the bomb once it's planted, it's almost impossible to see the Time Bomb coming before it gets installed. Yeah. So it can look like an innocuous run on R&D, and you don't go and res the ice just because you're like, whatever, it's a single on R&D. And now suddenly it's not a single, it's a single plus some Sabotage down the road, which I think is pretty cool.
Yeah, and it's Sabotage 3. Like, is that good enough for a card? Ideally, like you want a card to do a lot of sabotage. This thing is technically easy to play. It's also really nice that it's run-based sabotage. A lot of the cards that we saw, and maybe I just been playing too many Augustina decks, are kind of like passive sabotage decks where you just sit back and hope it works. At least this you're interacting more, and one of the other cards we're going to see forward as well. The question is whether you can take Sabotage outside of ESA, and you can add Sabotage to like a standard Anarch and just play it like good stuff, regular Anarch. Does Sabotage fit in that mold? And I'd be surprised if it does, because again, I don't think Sabotage works unless you're doing a lot of Sabotage. I think small amounts of Sabotage just don't cut it.
So I think you're right that ESA is probably going to be the primary sabotage vehicle for a while. But I actually think Time Bomb is really helpful at opening up a non-ESA based sabotage, especially when we talked about a card we're going to get to later. There's now 3 cards that you can pretty easily run outside of ESA that can add up to, low double digits of sabotage. When you combine that with some other multi-access, that's probably enough accesses to win you the game in a lot of cases. And Time Bomb is, I would say, pretty aggressively costed.
Yeah.
Right? Like if you're accessing 3 cards for 1 credit, that's beating out a maker's eye. Now you're paying a click and like there's other costs and stuff, but like also compared to Chashushka, this is 2 credits less, 1 sabotage less, but you get to run any central. So this card is actually really easy to play for pretty high impact relative to the other sabotage effects we've seen.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. And it's a big thing to say also what Sabotage inherently does for the game, right? Like Sabotage increases the power of HQ runs. Generally, people will discard their worst cards from HQ if they can. So like, as if you have other ways in your deck to capitalize on that, like maybe a more run-based aggro runner. Again, I think you are going to try to run a lot with Hoshiko. Yeah, maybe this just works. Yeah, it's cool. It's cool. It's disruption. It's like pseudo soft multi-axis with a bit of disruption, but it's also up to the corp. And that's why I think Sabotage is interesting, because it's like multi-axis that's kind of skill dependent. It actually allows your opponent to have a say in how it's going to go. And some players will sabotage worse than other players. So your mileage may vary.
Yeah, for sure.
What do you think about this one? Do you think this is an archetype role player? I don't know if it's a faction staple, but I think it could be on the cusp.
I don't think it's a faction staple, but I think it's going to be a pretty important part of an Anarch archetype that's built around sabotage, whether that's ESA or not.
Yeah, I'm putting that left of Katorga as a very early start.
Yeah, it's funny. Like I think Katorga is the more broken card in Eternal, but I think in standard that we're looking at, Time Bomb is the stronger card.
Yeah, that's for sure. Eternal is a different question. Any recursion in Eternal, it's going to be worth considering. So cool, awesome. All right, I think this is our only. Not a program, but the only breaker. This is actually pronounced Abasu, says the pronunciation guide. This is a 2-cost decoder. It's an icebreaker. Classically, it's worth noting, Anarchs are meant to have the worst decoder, so let's keep that in mind. And it says the first time each turn this program fully breaks a piece of ice, you may trash a card from your grip to draw a card. So it gives you that card cycling. It gives you 1-for-1 subroutine, which is nice, and 2-for-2 strength, but it comes in at a low 1 strength. Only 2 influence as well, so anybody could consider playing this. It's hard to talk about icebreakers in Anarch in standard, because it's kind of been a solved thing for such a long time with these conspiracy breakers, the bin breakers, Paperclip, MK Ultra, and Black Orchestra. It's just been the thing everyone's playing. They're okay. They're okay at breaking stuff. They're not the best. Paperclip's really good. Black Orchestra and MK Ultra are like not bad to fair. But there's just so many other reasons why you want to play them and not consider anything else. Like currently we got Buzzsaw, we now have Abasu, we have a lot of ways to deal with code gates, and some of them are much more efficient and much better than what's the gold standard. And I'd argue to some extent some of the other stuff is a bit underappreciated. It's hard to challenge it. Is this challenging Black Orchestra? Is the break costs?
I don't think this is challenging at Black Orchestra. I think if there was a meta with lots of 1 and 0 strength code gates, then Abasu maybe could have some argument, because unlike Black Orchestra, you have to spend a click to install this, but you probably get that click back by just cycling cards from your hand over the course of the game, which is a really interesting effect to have on a decoder. I think it's going to always be a little bit of a hard sell when you have Buzzsaw also right next to it, because this is never going to be that efficient to break ice. So you're probably playing this as your decoder because you're building up some kind of combo where you want to draw for specific cards. And then you say, oh, well, I can put this decoder in as basically extra draw in my slot that's normally dedicated to icebreakers. It's really like, it's funny. This does synergize with the heat breakers because you want to throw them out.
Yeah.
But if you're playing this, why like it's like, well, but if I already have a decoder, why would I be playing Black Orchestra as well?
And
But
I think there's maybe an
yeah,
argument, right? Like the idea is if you break in thimble rigs, right? It's a nightmare. In theory with Black Orchestra. It's just like a very niche board state where like you realize how bad Black Orchestra is. And there's not a lot of decks that are forcing that issue, but every once in a while. I just play Amakua though, right? That's the problem.
yeah, Amakua's influence, and sometimes you're in an IP block thimble rig meta.
Yeah.
Like that's happened. So like, yeah, there's definitely niches for this. It's a very respectable breaker. 2 to install, 1 MU is pretty solid. Like 2014 Anarchs would be killing for this. So
Yeah. So this reminds me of an old card called Zool, which was very similar in a lot of the numbers. I think it was only one influence, and it was a Shaper decoder. It was like very not special, but it was something that criminals were excited to splash in as access to a cheap enough decoder because they didn't really have anything worth playing in faction. Now we have Cat's Cradle, which basically takes that shape, but this is the sort of thing that I'd actually to some extent, and not that criminals want to trash their cards, it kind of seems like it's a possibility for a strange faction like Adam to play or Sunny to play to maybe allow you to churn through your deck with Sunny when you have a lot of cards to draw. It's just not the best at anything. I don't know whether the K2CP Turbine makes this kind of fire, but I think the K2CP Turbine makes all breakers fire. So I don't know if you want to do this one over any other.
yeah, actually, you saying that, I'm like, yeah, maybe like old Val decks would have definitely thought about playing this in certain metas, I think, just to churn through their deck a little bit more. But yeah, I think this is kind of it's an okay breaker. It seems a little bit outclassed by both Black Orchestra. And I was about to say, like, oh, if you could play this with Leech, that'd be great. But if I'm playing a Leech rig, I'm probably playing a Buzzsaw
Yeah.
Leech rig instead. So
Yeah.
um,
It's
yeah.
strange. It's really strange. It's definitely like a very weird breaker. That's not bad. It's also worth noting that a lot of the break costs on like the low to mid range stuff on this is like totally respectable. And even some of the higher strength stuff, it's not different than Black Orchestra. Like the break costs aren't far off. Like
Yeah.
you're breaking Magnet for 3. That's what you expect to do anyways. But on top of this, you get the card cycling, which is probably worth, some amount of virtual credits. So I don't know. It's not bad. It's honestly not bad. I just don't think I'll see anybody play it, which is wild.
Yeah, yeah, it's like one of those things where it's like, yeah, if you compare every ice, it's totally fine, but I don't think we're gonna see it.
Yeah. Weird how that is. Where are we putting it? Like, I think it's
I mean,
niche.
like, yeah, I was gonna say, I think it's niche, even though it's probably a perfectly respectable card.
Yeah, it's weird how you can tell this. It's like, this is one of the best cards that no one's going to consider. It's like, well, am I going to change that? Probably not. That's depressing, I guess. All right, cool.
Yeah, I almost wonder if I'm gonna see more raindrops cut stone than Abasu.
I think you are. I think you really are.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. We got another cool program. This is called Hush. This is the Trojan subtype. That's a subtype that has also been retroactively added to some of the old cards. It means it's a program that's going to be installed on a piece of ice, which is where you have to install it. 1 credit, 1 MU. It says host ice that this is hosted on cannot gain abilities, and they lose all abilities except the printed subroutines. And as a click, you can move this thing around to another installed piece of ice. This, you have to be doing it outside a run. There's no way to reposition this. You have to have forethought or you have to guess to some extent. What ice are you blanking with this?
I mean, the one I mostly be blanking is border control, I think. Like,
Yep.
there's like a bunch of other, like, I don't think you can play this for just border control, but, border control, Funhouse, maybe Anvil if that becomes part of the meta. Like, there's a lot of cards that have on encounter abilities or that have, like, blanking on the Nazis pretty nice. It means you could maybe let some of those subroutines fire because arguably they're not that bad.
I think every faction has something, right? Like you have Loki, you have Mess and Chestfo. Like some of these get more niche, but I don't think there's any faction where you sit down and think Hush is going to do nothing. Obviously, some are more impactful than others, but the floor is not as low as you might imagine.
Yeah, it's just kind of tricky because you're like, okay, I'm going to spend a card slot, a click, a credit, and an MU to make one piece of ice in the corpse deck significantly worse. Like probably almost not worth its res cost if cards are balanced right. But then you kind of go, that's a lot of cost when I could play a sure gamble in that same slot and maybe deal with that problem in kind of the straight up economy way.
So just speaking for the slot in standard, are there other ways to have this effect? And I think the biggest one by a mile is Hunting Grounds, which is still in the standard for the next year or so. And it's a one influence card that a resource you install that allows you to blank the when encounter text on an ice. Now that doesn't cover all cases. That does cover, I think, like 60 to 70% of the cases. Like you still have border control. You still have mostly border control. I guess IP block blanking that too is technically works with Hunting Grounds as well. But yeah, that's the idea, is that there's other ways to do this that are not only less clumsy, but they also don't fight for like MU and for time, which is kind of a hard sell on this thing.
Yeah, that said, I would not be surprised to see, especially like a fully teched out shaper, um,
Yeah.
especially due to a card we're going to be talking about at some point. Just say, hey, you know what? I've got an influence left. I can slot this Hush in, and it solves all of these problems that my deck would have, and so it's going to fit right in, kind of thing.
Yeah, that's a huge thing. Anytime you see a program that has a very niche temporal use case, like it's only good on certain board state, Shaper can pull it out at instant speed. And for that reason, I think for one influence, there are some Shaper control decks that would love to play this. And we'll probably see that in there way sooner than any other faction.
Yeah, I think this is very hard to play in Anarch because this
Yeah.
is not a fun gachapon hit. And that's really your only instant speed access to installing cards as Anarch.
Where are you putting this? I think this is like on the verge of niche. The Shaper use case is actually like quite good.
I think it's probably top of niche because like Shaper Control is a deck, but this is a niche. This is not a card that's always going to make the slots in that kind of deck. So
Yeah, meta dependent. So again, niche can go up and down pretty hard. All right, we got another Anarch program. This is Enga. This is a unique program. There's very few of those in the game. This is when you install this, go ahead and load 3 power counters on it. When it's empty, trash it. That sentence shows up a lot on cards in the runner side of the set, and I hate it for obvious reasons. We'll get to it in a bit. The first time each turn you make a successful run, you may remove a hosted power counter to sabotage 1. This is the easiest sabotage card ever printed that's now in the game, and this is actually very generous in some really unique ways. The sabotage fires when the run's considered successful, which is before you access, which means if you run HQ, you force a sabotage. So if they sabotage a card from HQ, maybe you have a better chance of stealing an agenda. Admittedly, there's chances that they can throw out the non-trap cards to make you hit the snare. So again, your mileage may vary, but the same idea. If you run archives and they sabotage from the top of R&D, you're just going to get that access on tempo, right? Right then, right now, which, that's kind of nice. It's worth noting for this and Time Bomb, we haven't exactly mentioned that they are charge cards in theory that you can. Have no real interest in making the Time Bomb hit harder or hit sooner, not even harder.
yeah,
This hitting more, I think, is actually a better charge target, still, albeit a niche use case.
yeah, I think it's difficult because like we'll talk about it when we get to it. There's still not a good charge card that I can splash out of faction easily to get consistent charge. And then if I'm in Shaper, it's hard to then splash enough sabotage effects in to really to take advantage of this having the charge synergy. Well, it's definitely there, and maybe it's not this set. Maybe a future set we'll see Anarchs play with charge or something.
Man, I can't wait to see cards that say sabotage with the no explainer text. And I'm glad there is explainer text, but like, I guess I'm always excited by the history Netrunner or the future Netrunner. So yeah.
Yeah, for sure. No, I think in terms of like this card does as many sabotages as Time Bomb does. It gets the third sabotages at the same time as Time Bomb, but it gets them on tempo a little bit faster. And there's no reason you can't be doing both. So you know, for 3 credits and 2 cards, sabotaging 6 is pretty nice. And I think if you can find some kind of aggressive aggro Anarch, this is not a terrible slot if you can throw it down and find a way to make that work.
Yeah, I don't mind it. And again, I think you want to play this in something that's more run based. I don't know if S is exactly that, but I do think like, again, Hoshiko's perfect for this. You generally want to access 1 card a turn. You want to run once a turn. Also, lovely thing about this card is that it's a May ability. So there are some board states where you can run and think, do you want to sabotage? No, there's a spin doctor in the table. No, I'm going to have a time bomb next turn and I want to stack those effects. And I love that flexibility of it. That actually has a skill cap to it. It's not just like, yeah, it's going to go off. Sorry. Because there's a lot of board states where sabotage is like not worth doing.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. What do you think about this thing? It's like, I think any Anarch can play this. I'm a bit concerned whether this is going to be better than whatever other 45 cards are going to play, but like it's very playable.
Yeah, I think this is probably a role player. I think it goes lower than Breakout, but yeah, I suspect they're going to stay pretty close to each other.
I think you're going to see more of this than Breakout. And like, I just don't think Breakout is a target now, but I think it has a higher ceiling. Would you agree with that?
That's a fair way to evaluate. Yeah, I think that's true.
Okay.
I think that's a reasonable evaluation. I like Time Bomb more just because it's less investment, so it fits easier into an ESA deck I can build. So
yeah, and it's more impactful. Like the power turns, I think you can feel more than just like a small 100 stabs or the 100 cuts. So
yeah.
Phenomenal. The Anarch cards right now in this set have been kind of very fascinating because they're kind of hard to evaluate. I've been appreciating this. This is Numb. Yeah. It's a 4-cost sentry. It's Mimic times 2. So it's like Mimic. It's a fixed strength breaker. It's 2 to break a single sentry subroutine. It's 3 influence, which is wild, but it's 8 base strength and has no ability to increase its strength. Is there any card currently in standard that 8 strength does not deal with? I think the
I mean,
biggest is the Stavka.
there's
That's 7.
yeah, I think there's no
Tier? Is tier 8?
sentries. Oh, that's a good question. No, tier is 7 actually.
Tier
So
7
you've
strength.
got room to spare.
So if you asked me, do you want a piece or an icebreaker that breaks 2 credits for a subroutine? And classically, sentries have been having the most subroutines. That's meant to be a recurring sentry theme. That's not exactly the case all the time, but that's what you'd expect. So there's a lot of ice that this goes through for like 6 credits. Like you're looking at a Nancy for 6 credits, but breaking a Nancy for 6 credits in Anarch is like kind of okay. Like it's honestly not that bad. Now this is a 4 credit program that is kind of expensive. It's also not a bin breaker, so you're gonna have to spend that click up front, but that's not the worst. This is a bad use case when you're breaking. I don't know. I feel like even breaking like a what's it called? A turnpike for 2 credits is like fine.
But breaking a drafter for 4 feels
Terrible.
pretty rough. Yeah.
Really bad.
Like yeah, it's like, okay, hold on. There's a drafter on the table. I gotta go install my 4-cost sentry breaker to get permission to go and spend another 4 credits each time I want to run through your drafter. And
Yeah.
like paying 6 for an Ansel does feel not great as well.
But that's
Like,
not bad for an Anarch. Like you're expecting to pay
yeah,
6
but
and a click or 9.
I mean,
You
sure, because
shouldn't.
we're using it
Yeah,
like
if you do
yeah,
that, the
yeah.
game's going bad, but that's what you expect to do if you have to do it. You just generally don't have to do it.
Yeah, it's like, yes, this is efficient for the highest strength sentries, but there's enough sentries around that aren't the highest strength and have 2 subroutines where I
Yeah.
feel like Gnome really suffers, in addition to the costs of not being a bin breaker, which are pretty hard to overstate. Like just how much those cards, the whole Anarch package of economy and card draw and everything is built around those cards.
Oh
And
yeah.
so deviating from that has pretty high costs. The other thing that like it's not the most pertinent right now, but like a Colossus with sufficient advancements becomes unbreakable. A corporate troubleshooter kind of ruins your day completely.
Sure, but
So
like you're gonna get Zatoed anyways, right? Like what does it matter?
yeah, that's true.
So
I think it hurts more to get Zadowed after you spent 4 credits to install
yeah.
this program, but
They just trash it. I think a big use case of this is the way that it works with things like potentially Poison Vial, which is a card we'll talk about. The idea that you can deal with an Anansi for just 2 credits, like that's kind of fascinating. Or seeing this as like a relief valve. The idea that you can play, of course, it's 2022. You can play Endurance and then use this as a panic valve, so you can deal with like the Anansis or any of the 3 strength sentries. I think that's still a really hard sell. That's generally what Botchos is used for if you need to use it, and that card kind of involves or gets involved in like a tech war of its own problems. But yeah, I don't know. 3 influence too. It's like it's hard to splash this outside of faction where it may be in criminal, but you already do have good killers. I'm not sure what to do
yeah,
with it.
you have
I think it's
multiple good
startup.
killers still.
Startup, this is good because right now Anarch and startup has like no way to deal with high strength sentries.
They've got Mimic and Data Sucker or Leech, excuse me.
Sure, but like face check into a Stavka,
Yeah,
it's
yeah, yeah.
like, yeah, no, you have to
Yeah,
play this if you want to play super safe Netrunner, which I don't always recommend.
yeah. I think that's the thing is like this is a very safe card, but a lot of the best runner decks try and live on the edge a little bit more, and so I
Yeah.
sort of expect this to mostly be not it. You know, if we end up in a really controlly Anarch deck, then maybe this does see play, but I don't think it does outside of that.
It's worth shouting out anything that has really high strength interacts strangely with some other niche cards. Like there's the Shaper card that allows you to like spend a click to break a subroutine. Not a very powerful card, but things that like require base strength to be attached to. This is something you can play with, but it's 3 influence, so I hope you're doing it in a faction that makes sense.
Yeah,
I think this is pretty niche. I think this is
agree.
probably has a harder use case than Abisu.
I agree. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. All right. We got one more Ana card. This is pronounced Tsiahya Banhar Gantulga. I'm going to be saying Banhar, the name in the quotes. It's a connection resource that's unique, only 1 credit. And when your turn begins, you may choose a server. It's optional. That's always nice. And during the first encounter each turn with a piece of ice protecting the chosen server, whenever a subroutine would resolve on that, instead, you just take a net damage. It does do a net damage subroutine. I think this is the card that I haven't played yet. From my understanding, it wasn't working on jnet at the time of testing. But it's one of the cards that I'm most interested in because I think this could be so wildly misevaluated that I'm going to be very cautious with my evaluation of this thing. This card reminds me of Faust. Faust was a breaker, an AI breaker back in the day that said you could spend cards from your hand to boost strength and break subroutines. And it was an AI, so it broke all types of ice. And then people realized you can build a good enough draw engine in a deck. You can deal with the cheap ice and the big ice really efficiently with other support cards, and you could just go kind of wild. Now, it's a very different situation to right now where you don't have like infinite recursion. You don't have the best card draw comparatively to back then. But the idea is that you can take the biggest ice, like a Fairchild 3, and just kind of make it say, do 3 net damage. That is kind of attractive.
No, I agree. I think this card scales not as well as Faust does.
Yeah.
But it slaps down and becomes in play much earlier than Faust ever did. Like this is a turn one, well, a turn two play where you slap this down turn one for 1 credit. Now the corp has to double ice the remote if they want to have any business scoring. Like there's outside of an op trying to score behind an envelopment, there's basically not gonna be any ice in the game that stops you from just running through it. Maybe an endless Eula, I guess, but
it's really funny because it says when subroutines resolve, and I thought for a second you'd run into an envelopment and just like flatline. But if the first end the run resolves, none of the other ones resolve. It's worth knowing it actually ends the run, so you're thrown out. You don't have to hit.
No. You would take 5 net damage because you're replacing all of the resolutions with do a net damage.
Because they don't resolve. Oh, you're totally right. You would actually flatline.
Yeah. Yeah, assuming you had 4 cards in hand. Yeah.
No,
like the endless Eula with no steel skins in hand is a guaranteed flatline. Cool. So it's I
still think like it's still worth playing. I still think it's a good card.
Oh yeah, no, hey, if a corp is trying to score behind a magnet or a border control, yeah, take 2 net to run through a 3 or 4 cost ice and on turn 1, 2, 3, like that's great. Sniping a Rashida for 2 cards is by far worth it for the runner. And what's probably going to happen is most of the time the corp is going to say, yeah, it's not worth it for me to rest this ice. And so you've installed this resource that cost you a click and a credit, and it saved you like so much time and tempo. I'm also pretty high on this card.
And like we talked about Avasu and Numb, and this is like another kind of nail in that sort of coffin where it's like, just play the bin breakers. Like if they get trashed from hand, it literally makes you more powerful. So yeah, that helps. You did mention like the 2 ice thing, and I think that's actually a fascinating part of this card, is that this card is the first encounter, which means if they don't res ice, they're not encountering that ice. So it'll be the first ice that's actually resed, which is like a really cool play pattern because it challenges the inherent play pattern of Hippo, where a lot of runners or a lot of corps, will put their best ice, and then in front of it, they'll put an unresed ice that they have no intention of resing on the basis that it keeps the ice safe from Hippo, because the Hippo cares about breaking the outermost. And this means that like your Fairchild 3, you're more likely to connect than in most other cases if they're playing around Hippo, which they should be.
Yeah, no, I mean, this has a lot of really strong interactions in faction. I suspect we're going to see it in a lot of places. It's not going to go in your like Apocalypse combo decks, but it's going to go in like your kind of, I think it fits really well into fair Anarch decks, which is kind of a crazy sentence that like, oh yeah, this card that does net damage to myself, like, yeah, it fits in my fair good stuff deck.
Do you think that there's enough card draw to support this? Because like I don't think you rely on it. I don't think like you pull R&D and then just start slamming finalities, which is actually something you can do. This is not a remote server only. Like you could diversion of funds or some nonsense. Not probably a good use case, but like, do you think you have a card draw to be able to fire this every single turn? I feel like you don't. I feel like this is a niche use.
You probably can't fire this every turn, but it doesn't, you don't need to fire it every turn because it just like Faust, you didn't actually run every turn with Faust. You made careful calculated runs on where the corp was weakest and used Faust as kind of your safety valve. And I think this Bankar can do much the same thing. So
playing as a corporation and realizing like, whoa, this is on the other side of the table will change how you play. And I do think you're going to need to chump block it with some small ice, and it'll have an impact. It's obviously you still have to deal with ice later on, but this is cool. I want to evaluate this way higher than I think it's going to be.
I mean, I think given how we've talked about it, putting it not in faction staple would be a betrayal to our conversation.
It's another card that I don't think people are going to play because it's terrifying, but maybe it's the card in like 4 months people realize like, wait, we've been sleeping on this thing and this thing's actually like kind of does something unfair. And that's I think there's going to be lots of situations where you're like, yeah, I want to get into the server way more than I care about any of the cards in my hand. So those are all our Anarch cards. We've got a lot of event support, which I think makes a lot of sense. We're seeing Ghost Tongue packages in ESA. That's like being commonly played right now. But they're very interesting cards. I think we got the more niche out of any faction we've seen in a long time. But they're, I don't know, these sort of cards too, I think are going to be kind of always relevant. Or I'm more so like, I think we're going to be revisiting them pretty heavily once there's a rotation of, say, the bin breakers. I think that's going to happen with most programs. So yeah, excited for the future.
For sure. Yeah. To some extent, it's like, oh, yeah, it'd be great to reevaluate a lot of the set if in the context of no bin breakers, because I think that's going to be such a different world for Anarch.
Yeah, no idea how that works. Okay, let's move on to some criminal stuff. This one's really interesting. I think this one's like surprisingly divisive. This is Concerto. It's a run event, costs nothing. And when you play it, you get to reveal the top card of your stack and place credits on this event equal to the printed play or install cost of the card you revealed. You then get to add the revealed card to your hand. Once you've done that, then you get to choose what server you want to run on, and then you can spend those hosted credits during that run. Hosted credits that you don't spend are lost. It's like overclock. It's just kind of money for the run. But in short, this is draw a card, gain some amount of money, run a server. I think on fundamentals alone, that's a very good card. I do think it's very easy to look at this and build into it and think like, oh, I'm going to play all my femme fatales and get 9 credit runs and it's going to be absurd. And I don't think you have to do that. I think when you look a lot of criminal lists, like standard good stuff 419 decks like now modernly, the average install play cost is somewhere between 2 and 4. So is it enough to get 3 credits and a card and a run all in a single card? It's honestly, it's kind of on the cusp. It's on the cusp of like 46th card syndrome, but I'm
Oh
a big fan
no,
of it.
Andre! I'm gonna come in and just like,
Dude,
I think this
I'm
card's
okay.
garbage. I think this card's is borderline unplayable.
Really? Why?
Yeah, because we're playing criminal, and this does nothing for me. Turns 1 through 5.
Yes, I do think. Go ahead. I'll rebut.
Yeah.
I'll rebut
So
after.
basically, like my point, the reason I say that is because if I'm playing a regular criminal deck, the only way I have of spending run of credits during a run is trashing assets or paying for icebreakers. And if I'm getting multiple credits of value early, like that's just not going to be something that happens early in the game most of the time.
Mhm.
And so that's like one strike to me against this card is if I draw this early in the game, it's probably a dead card. If I draw it too late in the game, it's probably also a dead card again because either my deck has run out or it's just like, oh, I have to be able to make a run. And like, does playing this and then going, okay, let's hope I draw my expensive card. Oh shoot, I drew an easy mark. For the sake, not actually an easy mark. There's other 0 and 1 cost cards we'll talk about that you are always slotted. Like I drew a pinhole threading, right? Yeah. Oh, cool. I have 1 extra credit and I paid a card slot for that. Card slots are so hard to come by in criminal, and so having this variable payout card is tricky. I think if this was a shaper card, it would see a ton of play, but I think because it's criminal, it's actually pretty hard to find a consistent payoff for those credits that you're making off of this run.
Yeah, I hear you. I do think you're right about the fact that like there are staple 1 costs and 0 costs that make the floor of this really bad. Would you be okay with a run event that just said make a run, draw a card? Like, is that good enough click compression on a single card? Probably not.
I don't think so.
No, and considering some of the other cards you see, I do think the best use case of this by a mile is like prognostic and masterwork decks by like, that's not all criminals, but I'm a big fan of Az. And in that deck where you can see the top of your deck, you can organize the top of your deck, you can use this money on basically any central run, on any run, kind of like a Chesva type thing. That gets really valuable really quickly, but I hear you. Yeah.
Yeah. I think the other small problem with that style of deck is all of your cards cost 0, 1, or 2 credits. All of the hardware you're installing is at that like 0, 1, and 2 credits. Yeah, so like, right. Yes, you will convert that and you could say, hey, this is a card that I'm playing that draws me a card and installs another card. And that is a lot of tempo, but it's also your cards are kind of a little bit below the curve usually when you're playing those sorts of decks. Not always, but a little bit. So I'm still, it's a hard sell to me, I think.
Yeah, you talk about it at the end of the game, right? And like, I think to some extent, I don't know if you build a deck in a certain way, but like maybe, I don't think you're card counting at this point with Class Act, but I guess with Boomerang, that makes it even harder when you shuffle. But like at the end of the deck, if you can like pad your deck, yeah, that seems really realistic. Yeah, maybe I'm just really wrong on this thing.
Well, also, I could be really wrong on this thing too. Like, this is one of those cards where I looked at it and was like, yeah, this card's not for me. And like, there's gonna be blowouts with this card. It's not the most blowout of the criminal cards in this set, but
Yeah.
it like, and it's true. Like, hey, this card is really really good in the mid game. It's pretty good against asset mashups just
Yeah.
generically. So like, it's definitely got places, and like, yeah, make a run, draw a card. Yeah, you don't want to spend a card on that, but it's not it's not the worst floor of any card that you could put in your deck.
So like the obvious comparison, would you rather just play Overclock? And Overclock is a bit more consistent. You don't draw a card. And I think the worst part about Concerto is probably that it costs 0, funny enough, because you're probably running 2 or 3 Concertos. And when you concerto the Concerto, oh, that's not good, is it?
Yeah, and I think my part of my argument for like, or my evidence for why we're probably not going to see a lot of this is we don't see criminals running overclock. They have better ways of generating money in faction, and it's just not a very reliable piece for them. Whereas it is a very reliable piece for Shaper. But I don't know that you want to splash this for 2 influence in your Shaper list most of the time. So
Yeah, Shaper got other weird, inconsistent econ run cards, or not run cards. We'll talk about them, but yeah, there's other goofy stuff you can do at the top of your deck. I think you've convinced me that I feel like this might not have a home. I'm glad we had this conversation. Where would you put it? Because I'll tell you, I would put it about the archetype role player, and I think we're going to much lower than that.
I I would allow us to put in the bottom of archetype role player because this is pretty
No.
reasonable in prognostic Q loop as, but I think this can go in niche. I would put it behind Hush, but
Yeah, I think that's fine. I do think actually you're right in prognostic Q loop. The problem is like those decks, a lot of your hardware is incredibly cheap. You're not playing big cards in that deck at all. I wonder if you can build an archetype where like you're pulling in an endurance or like a security nexus, something like that. And that could build into something, but it's yeah, it's not very consistent, is it?
no, not yet at least.
Yeah. Speaking of not yet consistent, potentially one of the most powerful cards ever printed, potentially a 2-cost event called Reprise. It's a run event, and you can only play it if you stole an agenda this turn. You get to add 1 installed card to HQ, and then you may run any server. So this is a Leela type card, but while Leela bounced on steal or score, this is only on on steal the same turn, but you can return any card to hand. It can be a res card, it can be install advanced card, it can be absolutely anything. This is potentially the biggest blowout on any runner card ever printed, and it is impossible to see coming. How difficult is it to
Yeah.
fire consistently? How much of a cost is it to keep a dead card in your hand for a couple turns while you're looking for the best opportunity for this to land, let alone the possibility for it to fire? It's a card that I'm definitely excited to test. I feel like the ability on this is nonsense powerful.
Oh yeah, no. If you can fire this, I mean, you could fire this off every game. It is ban me please level, I think.
Yeah.
Like the ceiling on this card is just enormously high. I'm kind of skeptical it's going to hit that ceiling that often. Just because stealing is generally a pretty kind of random act, and like if you steal this for like Leela was really good because you always had basically Leela was always active,
Yeah.
and so you could know that yeah I'm going to get some windows, I'm going to be able to run R&D and or run HQ and get the lucky access and then kind of blow open the game. And this says, oh, I have to hold this in my hand for the entire game to make sure I can find my window, which I think
It's
is, it's tricky. Everyone always is like, oh, I can't take a core damage in criminal, but like playing this card is committing to playing a core damage in your deck.
Yeah, to some extent. People bring up the whole like mad dash argument, and like that's a card that just burns a hole in your pocket and is worth playing. Is it more impactful than this card? Honestly, yeah, in certain agenda suites, and especially the agenda suites that are only running 6 agendas, where mad dash wins you the game, and this like maybe doesn't even fire, right? Like it's
Yeah,
hard.
it's like I think even if like it's yeah, Mad Dash earns a spot because it takes a like we think about a lot of the best decks from the last year and a half. It's been corp decks that are like I'm going to win on 1 fewer score than a
Yeah.
runner is, and Mad Dash says no, we're going to win on the same number of scores. This like even against like precision, like I feel like precision design, one of the decks that I would imagine this to do the absolute most against. Probably this doesn't win you the game if you steal this in the mid game. You bounce one of their ice and they say, okay, I'm going to keep turtling up, but you're not going to like blow open the entire board because you got a single reprise off.
Yeah,
Um,
so that's like a huge thing is like there's so many cards in the card pool that are like D-res cards or force res cards, right? Like emergency shutdown abstractly is powerful. But the idea that you could in theory return an Anansi to hand sounds really good because that's a cost like loss of credits, let alone return to hand if to reinstall it. Like all that stuff is very powerful. This, yeah, I think the HB or like in sports metal, this is like such an easy card to fire, but is it actually that impactful for 2 credits? At least you get the run though, which is I think a really big
Yeah.
part of this card.
No, I mean this card is really, really strong. I think it's just tricky to figure out exactly how much it's worth putting into your deck, how much you can consistently get payout from it when you get to play it. Because yeah, there's gonna be really big payoff turns, but it's, to some extent it's like, oh, was I already winning the game when I played Reprise?
Yeah.
And did this mean that I went from having I think the question when you're trying to think about if Reprise fits in your deck is, does Reprise take me from a 60% to a 90%, or does it take me from a 90% to a 95%? And that's sort of the question you're going to be asking yourself, I think.
Yes. And think like a thing that's always been fascinating me with this card, and we saw this a bit in Leela decks, is that there are certain decks that are playing effects like this. They need to have not consistent, but on-demand strong multi-axis. If you're going to play something like a control deck and you see there's installed advanced events in a remote server, or like there's an upgrade or an ice that you can't deal with, like a lot of use cases for this card. That's the sort of deck where you would like want to do like a Hushuk maybe. Like Deep Dive doesn't make a lot of sense. Stargate, I think, is a possibility where you could even leave cards in archives until it matters. But you also need to make sure that your deck has a way to consistently fire this. Like it's hard to do finality when you can lose this to core damage. But you need also a deck that's not just like, oh, I'm gonna just like jailbreak R&D and hope that works out. Because I feel like if you can't consistently get this on board states that it matters, it's gonna feel more like a brick than a rocket.
Yeah, you really are going to want something like a legwork and probably a Maker's Eye. Like if we had something like an indexing in the pool, I think the stocks for this card goes way, way up. So like this could be a card we revisit and rank higher in the future. But I think this card's like, it's really interesting. And this is the card I expect to get made the fool by the most, because I will probably never put this in a competitive deck, and I will probably get wiped out of many COs by people playing like, this card.
This is going to have the highest highs. Like you're going to remember so many games that you're like ahead, 90 to 10, and then someone steals a cheeky gen on a thing and like removes an ice on the HQ, and then you get the version, and they run the remote server, and suddenly you lost the game. Like you're going to feel that. This one's going to sear into your memory, which is that's good for the card at least. Where do you want to put this? Like it's on, if it's playable, it's like one of the most powerful things in the whole set.
I know it's like, this is one of those ones where it's like, I want to put it like my heart, my brain's telling me this is niche, but like, it's not like,
it's generous.
I would probably put it in archetype role player. I think I put it to the right of Time Bomb.
Okay. Yeah, fine.
Yeah. I don't know. This is, I think I'm fairly low on this card, but also I think like if we do see burst multi-access criminal, like this card's gonna go up in stocks.
Yeah, if it can fire consistently, like maybe it opens up entirely control criminal, where it's just like, again, hammer R&D. Oh, you tried to score solid advance, you've lost a whole turn, let alone everything else. Okay.
Yeah,
we got a weapon. It's Poison Vial. When you install this, load 3 power counters on it. When it's empty, trash it. Love that sentence. No. Host a power counter, break up to 2 subroutines, but you can only use this ability only if you've already broken a subroutine during this encounter. So this is cool. It harkens back to E3 feedback implants, an old criminal hardware. It also costs 2. That for a lot of Netrunner players is like their favorite pet card. Like for unexplicable reasons, it's just everyone's favorite card all at the same time.
It's amazing how many people are like, "Where's my E3 feedback replacements?" And like for a little bit, I was one of them. I was a huge Overmind E3 feedback player, and then I was wait, this is so bad. Like this card combination is just terrible.
Yeah, you play with Faust, you play with David. There was a lot of good uses for it. You can do with Byroids a bit better, but this is an E3 feedback implants that breaks not infinite subroutines, but it breaks them a lot cheaper than E3. E3 was a credit per subroutine. You could do any amount. It wasn't always in bursts of 2. But the question is, where do you play this in criminal? Because I don't think there's a lot of cards in the criminal card pool that this actually interacts with favorably. But for me, most of the stuff that I'm thinking to use this are kind of outside the criminal card pool, right? Like endurance is kind of a really huge deal with this thing. The idea they can put down an endurance, and then the sort of like 3 or 4 subroutine challenging ice are now not a problem. And this doesn't get used that quickly in those matchups, which is huge. You have other cards like, we don't have Grappling Hook in the meta anymore. You could use this with Gabali and Kongamato, which is really interesting, but that's like a Shaper package. That's like a very unique deck. That's really exciting. You could use this with Numb that we talked about before. If that's somehow the best way you can deal with sentries, I doubt it. There's a lot of use cases for this thing.
Yeah, to me, I would expect, like, this feels very much like an AS card. It's a hardware, and like it extends like a boomerang. Like if we like in a hypothetical world where we start seeing a lot of I don't think it's really for the Parhelion meta at the moment. I think it's really the unfortunate conclusion for this card. If we end up in a meta where 3 and 4 subroutine ice become a little more common, suddenly this plus a boomerang gets you through everything. And this gets you, like, as a floor, if you are installing this for 1 credit and you're breaking 6 subroutines, you're making 5 credit, you're making 5 credits of value on that in some way. So it's like, it's not, you're not playing it for an economy card optimally first, but it's not like it is making you some money if you're paying a credit per subroutine, as long as you're consistently breaking 2 subroutines with this. So it's, it's okay. It definitely feels like it's missing some kind of piece to really go with. Like, I think the pirate decks with the loss of Tech Trader have a much harder time kind of justifying themselves.
Yeah, doing something too functional. Yeah, I agree. I think the boomerang thing is a real easy thing to use. And again, I just don't think modernly there's a lot of subroutines that are worth spending vial counters on. Like, you can boomerang a mouseless, he'll be fine, right? Like, it's a Nancy is the only one that's really problematic. But yeah, I guess you can get a bit farther with a revolver. Not that we've seen that catch on, but if you want to play weapon tribal, I guess you can. It's weird. I think future design space is going to be pretty important for this thing, but I don't think maybe there's like a misinteraction somewhere that we both can't think of that's really powerful on, but I'd be surprised.
Yeah, there's nothing in the current card pool that stands out. This does feel a little bit more like it's teeing up for something in the future.
Yeah, that's cool. I like the flavor. Weapons, a fun subtype. Criminals feel more like criminals, and I like it. I think this is a niche card, potentially powerful, but I don't think it has a use case right now.
I don't think it's shame because I think people will love it, but
I like it.
And I expect to see this in places because people love their breaker amplifiers.
Yeah, endless hunger. We can play this on Apex. Let's go. All right, this is a Wake Implant. And it's a cybernetic hardware. Every faction, mind you, got cybernetics in the set, and they're generally pretty good. When you install this, you take a meat damage because it does go into your body. Whenever you make a successful run on an HQ, you can place a power counter on this. It's technically also a charge target. When you breach R&D, you may remove up to 3 hosted power counters to access that many additional cards. It's worth noting that this combines with a lot of other multi-access cards in the game. If I'm not mistaken, it at least works with twinning. I'm not sure if it works with like finality.
It does work with finality because, this is just basically any effect that is a when you breach access additional cards, this will stack with that. It's only cards so this will also stack with something like a conduit if you really wanted it to. But I don't know, this card I think is maybe one of the most pushed cards of the set, I'm going to say.
Yeah.
Like this multi-access, is particularly R&D multi-access and criminal, has been incredibly important. It's never existed, or when it existed, it was the turning wheel.
Yeah.
And this card gets powerful much faster than the turning wheel does. It is capped, which lowers some of that power. You can't just bank up for a Hail Mary, the way that was often the play pattern with the turning wheel. And it does require successful runs, but one cost, a meat, and basically being untrashable are all huge. Like, well, the meat's not an upside, but 1 cost and being untrashable are huge upsides over the turning wheel, where a lot of Corp's game plan against criminal was to find a way to trash the turning wheel. And you're not going to do that.
It's even wild. Like a month ago, criminals were really excited if they needed to go that way. Like a lot of those decks were playing the twinning, and it just came out and largely has invalidated the twinning outside of maybe still startup. I'm not even sure, but it's really aggressive. Again, it's a card that reminds us of turning wheel. Turning wheel was a staple in criminal decks. This gives you incremental, incidental, additional value for running HQ, and the payoff is big. Again, if you got big multi-access on command, maybe that's where Reprise gets even more play. But I think universally, like, it's very obvious this is a good thing. The one thing that I'm a bit nervous about is like whenever you make a criminal deck where you have too many triggers that fire off making successful runs on HQ, and then before you know it, it's like Toll Booth plus Endless Eula on HQ, and then these get dead. I do worry about that. Now, this does fire off of stuff like Sneaker Beta, which is nice. Like you can still get charges on this. So it gets a bit easier, but like I'm always really worried when I play a criminal deck where I put like this and a pan weave and like a DJ Fenris. I guess you don't do that so much in criminal, but
Yeah,
yeah, at some point like they see you coming, so they ice it up.
I do think though there's the turnaround. Like I think like the Sneak Door beta synergy is like huge, right? Now it's the corp really has to ice two. Like if they want to stop these R&D accesses, they have to basically ice 3 servers now, which is pretty brutal. And the other thing is when you have all these successful runs, you probably don't need to stack all of them in a given game to make them worth it. And it's just like, oh, I want to have different ones so that in the amazing games where I end up really ahead, I can just pound HQ and stay ahead. But otherwise, I can just stack a couple in the early game and I can throw the other ones out because HQ got 2-way stop and it's not going to hurt me too much.
Yeah.
The other thing I want to say is this is secretly, maybe not secretly, I think this is a fantastic Shaper card as well.
Yeah, it's cool.
Because like classically people just didn't ice HQ against Shaper, or they would put their like token first ice on HQ and that'd be the only ice that went on all game. And with Pudma in particular, you can charge this up pretty easily. And then something like Dow like has always had the question of why should the corp ever ice HQ? And this is actually a pretty good answer for that.
Yeah, the fact that you can charge this on tempo while it's just even like smashing R&D is kind of cool. It's like very similar to the twinning, but again, the twinning is a resource which is pretty fragile in the modern meta. But yeah, no, it's good. Meat damage is a real cost, that's for sure. But 1 credit, like this thing is real affordable.
Yeah, for sure.
Is this on the verge of ban me, please? I don't know. Like we were scared of the twinning.
I think this is just straight up much stronger than the twinning. I think the twinning requires you to build your whole deck to include this engine to support it. And this just says, do you want to run HQ? And so many good decks want to run HQ. I think, this is probably maybe the weakest ban me please card you could imagine, but I think it's still going to it's going to shape the whole meta. I would be surprised if that didn't happen. So people can clip that and play that back in a month. But
yeah, no, we'll revisit that for sure. I'm actually very excited, and I'm like those calls. I'm glad that we're comfortable enough to make them. So we'll look back on that. But yeah, obviously very, very powerful. A lot of multi-access, and you're running HQ anyway, so why not? Speaking about running HQ anyways, this is jnet chip. It's a cybernetic chip. When you install it, suffer a core damage. This one goes in a bit worse. And the first time each turn you make a successful run on a central server, draw 1 card. Real talk. When a lot of these criminal cards were spoiled, I was very excited about them because all of them did something other cards have already done. It was just like, oh, turning wheel again. Oh, DreamNet again, right? And like, that's not wrong. E3 feedback implants again. That's not wrong. But these are like just ridiculous versions of them, right? Like DreamNet sees competitive play modernly. It's a resource, which is rough. It's 3 credits. It does have other synergy with other stuff like the whole digital or link thing. That's a big part of it too. But for 1 credit and a core damage, this will draw you in a game like 7 or 8 cards while doing the thing you wanted to do anyways, like look at Wake Implant, right? This is fairly good.
I think I remember when this was spoiled, having debate with people like, is a core damage worth 2 credits and the change of hardware to resource? And I think the answer is pretty much yeah. And the core damage ends up also being a bonus if you want to play this in a kind of aggressive ESA deck as well, which could be interesting.
I love that so much. Like that, there's much more tools in ESA's the card pool to run. Like you're really encouraged to run the cards like this, cards like Enga, right? Like that sort of stuff is just good together, and I like that. It's the cybernetic subtype too. The cybernetic tribal stuff is also worth thinking about when talking about standard and startup. We'll get to that in a second too.
For sure.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of this, and I think even there's mostly all the mini factions would consider playing this. Obviously, DreamNet's also very playable, but like 2 influence, I don't think there's a deck that wouldn't consider this. That's not running all the time.
I also think one interesting thing is like a lot of decks that were playing DreamNet really want to play a second DreamNet, but like it didn't make sense to actually run 2 because it's unique. And now it's like, well, now I do get to run 2 DreamNets. I get to run one's an each chip and 1 DreamNet.
I haven't seen that happen yet, but it's gonna feel really good when you run archives and draw 2 cards, or of course run HQ is the best case.
Oh my goodness, that's going to be so brutal as the other side on the court, where the runner's just ahead on tempo, slams these down on turn 3, and you're just like, well, I mean, how do I keep up?
We haven't talked about the art, and I don't even think we've said her name, but like Sable, you can get that cheeky free run once per turn. Sometimes it's on an archive that's not iced up. The fact that it converts
Yeah.
easily into a card draw, like that makes that ability kind of just like a Beth Kilrain Chang. You get all versions of it if you set your deck up right, which is kind of wild.
Yeah, clickless card draw is great.
Cool. Yeah, you also get this just like DreamNet when you make the successful run. So you have another card in hand that helps with damage decks to some extent, as much as the core damage might not. But yeah, you've seen DreamNet. It's basically DreamNet, but pretty easily to be played. What are you thinking? This seems like a staple.
Yep, I think this is a faction staple. I think it's right up there with Finality. Yeah, I think that's probably a good place to put it.
Cool. Okay.
I think we'll see. I'll be interested to see if Finality ends up being any better than it, but the cards they're used such a different thing. It's really hard to say.
Yeah. I'm interested for the Finality versus Stargate argument, but we'll see that soon enough. This is Tremolo. It's a fractor. We talked about how Anarchs were meant to be bad at decoding. Technically, criminals were meant to be bad at breaking barriers. We'll see if that trend stays here. It's only one influence for this thing, takes up 1 MU, costs 3, and for 3 credits, you can break up to 2 barrier subroutines, but the ability for this to use this goes down for 1 for each installed piece of cybernetic hardware that you have. It starts at 2 strength, and you boost each strength for 2 credits, which is, it's okay. There's a lot of, I guess, 4 strength barriers do exist, and there's not that many higher strength barriers that are a lot higher than that.
No, I mean, like 4 strength is like the break point you really want to hit classically, and it's interesting. It's like one of those things that like got set in by Eli 1.0, and it's just changed. Like we've just like all the designers just said, nope, that's the peg. This is every icebreaker or every fractor and every barrier is based around that number in some shape or fashion.
Every time we talk about Netrunner, I feel like we have underevaluated Firewall, and I'm worried that we got to that point somehow. This thing is really cool. We just talked that there's 2 cybernetics that we put. I'm just going to hide the card for a second. They're up there at the top of the chart, right? So I think there's a lot of criminal decks that you're definitely going to be playing all of these. Whether, again, how many of these you're playing, there are unique cards when we talk about these cybernetics. So I'm not sure how many you're playing in a deck, whether you're just playing 1 and hoping to draw it, or you're playing multiple and you don't care to discard. That's another question. But the thing is with Tremolo, how many cybernetics do you have to install for this to be good? At 0 or at 3 cybernetics, this breaks barriers for almost for 0. The barrier slot, the fractor slot in criminal, what we've been seeing competitively over the last couple of months, it's actually a bit more flexible than people might have expected. Classically, there's always that 3 influence tax to play paperclip, and we're seeing some decks that are now getting pressured. You know, a bit of this is maybe just the endurance, but they're running things like Cleaver for less influence. And Cleaver's not amazing, but Cleaver deals with some of the cheaper eyes. It actually has a really nice place in the meta right now to break like endless Eulas, and that's kind of relevant. But how many cybernetics do you need to have for this to be reasonable? And how consistently can you get there? Because the dream is really, this is one of the best fractors in the game if you hit that dream point.
Yeah, I mean, I think even at one cybernetic installed, like this card's okay. It's nothing you're excited to install, but it's something you can like. You're not going to be like going, ugh, why did I play this card? Once you get it at 1, like you'll be breaking a border control, you'll be breaking an ice wall, like all these low strength stuff. You'll break those for 2 credits, and that's completely respectable. That's what a corroder would do, right? And then you'll probably like, I think basically every criminal deck is probably going to find, if you're going to put this in, you're going to find a way to run probably 3, maybe 4 cybernetics with the expectation that you'll see them over the course of the game, and this breaker will scale up with you. And like, yeah, breaking 2 subroutines for 0 credits, which basically means you break infinite subroutines, is really, really good, especially because we're seeing endless Eula around quite a bit. So I don't know. I'm pretty high on this card.
I think this is one of the best fractors in the game. I think it's reasonable to compare this with Paperclip, and it's 1 influence. Admittedly, you have to be playing cybernetics, which like if you're playing Anarch, if you're playing Essa, like auto include by a mile, 1 influence so easy. If you're playing criminal, I think you get there.
I'm so sad as the one person who enjoyed playing Begamot decks that there's no reason for me to ever play a Begamot deck again.
It's so wild. Yeah, Begamot gives you core damage, but this outclasses Begamot by a mile. Like it's really strange. Admittedly, you have to do strength, but I think overall it's easier to play. I don't know. I feel like at this point, if I'm playing a Cybernetic Criminal, I might not have to splash for a Fractor again, which is kind of a big gain of influence.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is like, it's still 3 to throw down, but I don't have to play Cleaver, and that's a really nice boost to my deck. So I can think about like maybe is there some way I can play Ghost Tongue and then two or 3 of the infaction, or I guess the 2 infaction cybernetics, and make that work.
And we'll talk about Shaper in a bit because Shaper obviously can splash this and get this really easily. Shaper's good at that, and Shaper has some cybernetics. So we'll see how that stacks up. But like with one influence is incredibly generous to this card. And I think a lot of times you'll see cards like that, which are like inherently support cards to something that they're expecting you to play, spend a lot of influence on. Brain Taping Warehouse is always the one that comes to mind. It's one influence. Is that a thing? Can you do that? Can you put all the Biroids into your NBN deck? Probably not. But like this one is, you can do it. Everyone just has cybernetics now. And a lot of them are pretty good. I'm really high on this card.
Yeah, I mean, to me, this is definitionally going to be an archetype role player, but I could see arguments for putting it in faction staple.
I want a faction staple it. Like, I would actually consider it here.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's fine.
Like, if we're saying that every criminal, like, we're basically saying every criminal deck is going to be running these 2 cybernetics. Is that good enough to make this playable? I think it is. And then out of that, like, maybe it goes even higher with Anarch and somewhere in the middle with Shaper.
I think you're right that every criminal deck is going to be running those two cybernetics. I'm not sure that means you could run Tremolo because I'm assuming that criminals are going to run 2 copies of Wake, 1 copy of Zenith is sort of my guess initially.
Yeah.
And this is like huge forecasting. And then I'm like, if I'm just doing that, maybe I'd rather have a paperclip instead because I will probably be equal or even for most of the game. And I don't have to worry about pre-installing this, which is a potential downside with the other cybernetics and a classical kind of breaker.
Yeah, that's true. I think I might have got too comfortable playing Cleaver and Criminal, but it doesn't feel that bad. So yeah, it's comparable to that for sure. Okay, should we move it down?
I think we're okay leaving. I don't mind it being where it is. So
okay. Well, obviously we'll reevaluate this once we get to the end of the list. Okay. Now we have some good boys and good girls here. This is Tunnel Vision. It's an AI icebreaker. It's 2 MU, 2 cost. Everything on here just says 2, besides the influence for some reason. Interface, it's 2 to break up to 2 subroutines. It's 2 for 2 strength. It starts at 2 strength, but most importantly, you can only use this on your mark. And of course, it will identify your mark for you if you don't have a mark yet. Wow. Many moons ago, the idea that you could give an AI breaker to criminal would sound buck wild. If you've been playing Netrunner like 5 years ago, Mammon existed for a minute, and it's probably actually a pretty reasonable card if it existed today. But an AI breaker, I don't know. I don't think I like this one so much. It's clunky. It's a lot of MU, and criminals don't have a lot of MU to use. The fact that it's only on your mark limits you. So sometimes it's just archives, and while you can still get value out of that, like, I don't think you're hitting the central surface that you want. I think if you want to get early aggression from criminal, like cards like Boomerang exist that, or even like backstitching if you really need some way to deal with your mark on the spot. And so for me, I don't actually know where I'd want to play this.
I guess to me, I think this card is pretty decent. I don't think you're going to see it a ton, but I've only had it played against me a couple times. I was playing exclusively Corp on my little
test
foray so far.
Yeah.
But I played against multiple Sables, all of whom slapped down Tunnel Vision, and it in basically every game had a couple of turns where it really aggravated my plans as the corporation. Because even though, like, yes, 1/3 of the time you're going to get archives and it's going to feel pretty rough, there's now enough ways for criminal to make value off that run on archives where at some point you feel like you need to slap it down. And then the other thing is when this does roll HQ, suddenly the criminal has pre-installed their Boomerang, and they get to use it as many times as they want that turn. And this starts becoming pretty impactful, even if it's not like the highest. It's not the most important card in the deck, but it's a really good. I'm going to call this like bridging card that you play in the early game, and then bridges you into a late game, and then you get all your breakers down, and you say goodbye to your dogs. They've carried you to the finish line, and the rest of your breakers take you home.
Yeah, I love how the name is a warning to make sure that you do eventually get to that end game and you're not stuck just with the sled dogs. Yeah, I don't know. It's just the numbers to me on this thing don't make a lot of sense. Like, it's just so inefficient comparatively that I feel like the cost of producing your breakers is probably worth pursuing anyways. Like, the idea that you have to break like a magnet on HQ, like that's already 4 credits. You pay 2 credits for this thing. Is it better to just go find your Cat's Cradle? And Cat's Cradle, mind you, doesn't break magnet all that well anyways. So I don't know. It's just like there's so much ice. Like if you put a mouseless on an R&D and you're running that, like this costs 1 billion credits. For me, it's just the numbers on it don't make sense.
I mean, I'm not breaking a mouseless with any icebreaker in the game except a Mina, right? So like,
that's true.
or a late game Unity. Like I think that's so it's like this card's got a role. I don't think it's the strongest role card in the game, or like this isn't going to be a meta definer. But
Yeah.
I expect that we're going to see a good chunk of it. If maybe not at the top tables, but definitely by mid tables, I think you're going to be playing against this a good chunk of your games because Sable's really solid. Clickless run is really good, and this is a way to turn on a clickless run. And I've had it, it's really weird to go to like experiential stuff, but like yeah, I had a turn where I had ice on HQ. They had no breaker. It was just this tunnel vision, and they double diversioned me because they rolled HQ, and it's like, well,
Yeah.
that's the game. And so like there's always going to be those highs, and tunnel vision is going to look great in those highs, and it's going to look pretty bad in some games where all you can do is roll archives.
And I think when you talk about like mid tables competitively, I think that's probably where I say this. Like, I feel like it's a card that is going to get optimized out of more consistent criminal decks, right? And again, I don't think we've still seen competitive standard players use Sable that well. We've seen it in startup quite well, and I do think you have good payoffs for that. But like, yeah, I do still feel like a lot of competitive players don't look at Sable as powerful or as consistent as some of the other options. And so,
Yeah,
is this also,
I
by the
think
way,
that
is this only Sable?
uh, I mean, I've seen someone play it in not Sable. I don't think it was correct. But no, I mean, like, yeah, I think you're completely right. I do think Sable's gotten a boost with a couple of cards, including
Yeah.
just like the generic, like criminals as a whole got a boost, and then like this and another card that we'll talk about in a few minutes are like really Sable cards, and start making the whole package make a little bit more sense. And I wouldn't be too shocked to see Sable do a little bit more damage than she did in just Midnight Sun meta.
Cool. Yeah. It's an interesting card. I like that it's divisive. And again, I think it's a big point that the AI breakers are not easy to evaluate or like everyone agrees on them. I think that's a good design for this. I think inherently this is an archetype role player. I'm feeling like just behind Reprise. Do you have stronger opinions?
Oh, okay. That's actually higher than I was going to put it, but
Oh,
I
cool.
think that's a good place to put it.
I do like Enga a bit better.
Okay.
Okay. Cool. All right.
Yeah, yeah.
All right, so this person's name is Ausmun Pula, is what the pronunciation guide instructs us. It says, when you install this resource, it's 2 cost, it's a unique connection. Search your stack for up to 2 virus or weapon cards with different names. So it doesn't have to be only virus or only weapons, you can combine. Host those cards face up on this resource so your opponent does see. They are not installed. When your turn begins, you may add 1 hosted card to your grip, and if there are no more hosted cards, trash this resource. Man, that sentence keeps coming up. It's 2 influence. And this to me is a huge question mark because obviously the bigger the card pool, the more options you have for this. But just talking about criminal, in terms of weapon, I believe it's only 2 cards. It's Poison Vial and it's Revolver. Inherently, those cards do work well together. They are a combo, which is nice. And when it comes to viruses in criminal, I think it's only Tranquilizer. Are we missing something?
Wait,
We're gonna check real quick.
I'm doing a quick check. Oh, well, Amaku is an obvious one.
Oh yeah, Amakui. That's huge. Okay, it's Amakui as well. That's nice.
And Tapworm actually.
Oh,
So
Tapworm too. Yeah, those are good
yeah.
cards.
Yeah, so okay, there's like 2 really good both bannable cards that this can tutor.
Yeah, okay. So that turns out that might be okay. But it's like it's a really fascinating card, right? Like, can you pay 2 costs to just ensure that you get your Amakua 1 turn and your Tapworm that turn, or 2 Tapworms, right? Like you can decide what it is when you search based on the board state, and that's
Well,
nice.
it can't be 2 Tapworms, unfortunately. It's
Oh,
2
different
different
names.
names.
Oh, huge. Okay, so you have to pick one of each. Is that good enough in criminal? Does it thin your deck? Yeah. Do you have to draw them at the start of turn? No, but that's the only time that you can draw them. So it's not like a mutual favor. It's not going to be like impact now. It's going to be impact in the future. Um, that's kind of interesting. It's a deck shuffler, which kind of matters for some sort of stuff, but it's also worth considering this thing outside of faction. Like having a universal virus tutor in Anarch, whether you can spend 2 influence on it, or in Shaper, whether you can spend 2 influence on it. That's also kind of fascinating. The idea that you could strap this down and just grab 2 Botulists, maybe in startup, that's pretty impactful. That gives you the ability to ensure that you can't get rushed out, which we've talked about. There's other cards in the set that we value that already can do that. This one to me is like a really strange build around. Is it good enough just to jam 2 costs to draw your Amakua in every game or get it out of your deck? I like deck thinners. I kind of do.
Yeah, it's tricky. If I'm just pulling Amakua, it's like, well, I could just play Mutual Favor instead and
Yeah.
get that Amakua like a click sooner. which is a big and potentially a click and the turn sooner kind of
Yeah,
thing,
yeah.
which is pretty notable, and also pay 2 credits less for it. So you need to do more than just get the Amakua. Tapworms may be a good accelerator. If I'm an Anarch, pulling a Fermenter and like I could maybe this is a freedom card. Like you
Yeah.
pull your Yusuf and you pull the next virus you need, and that way, you find it's only 2 influence, so it is pretty reasonably splashable. It's a really weird card because it's like the next approximation in my head is like, oh, this is sort of a supplier, but it tutors, so it's really not like supplier at all.
To me, it feels
Um,
like a street peddler. And like, while it doesn't have that ability to pull at instant speed and have a surprise, like it's top a turn and you don't get a savings on it, it's nice that it's like draw any 2 of these obviously typed cards from your deck is kind of okay. Is the Apex card that people play in virus decks, is that a virus?
oh, that's actually a really good shout. You could play this instead of SMC, and you get 2 cards instead of 1 in Freedom.
Yeah.
That's actually a
Oh,
really nice shout. Okay,
that's neat.
pretty cool.
Yeah, I think this is potentially neat. I think the fact that it's criminal is like the wildest thing. If this is an Anarch card, I think it would be very easy to include in anything. So I
Yeah,
think
for
we can go from
sure.
there. For what it's worth, criminal viruses as like a subtype, like a lore subtype or like a mechanical subtype are probably my favorite viruses. So I'm glad that has support, and I'm just excited to see more weapons. This person's riding up here
Yeah.
with battle rifles. Maybe that's going to come next. Who knows?
Yeah, and I think actually on the top right of the little car there are the virus chips as well, from like
Oh
the
yeah,
virus mem strips. Yeah,
so cool. Yeah, you got to slot those
yeah.
in. This is interesting. I don't know. Like this is a card, Amelia, I haven't had time to play with yet exactly, but I think what it does is functionally quite okay. The question is whether the card pool supports it, and I think in Anarch, it's no crypt, which I think is the only other virus tutor. Which you're glad it's not that, right?
Yeah, yeah, this is a good deal better than Crypt.
Yeah, so that's a role
To
player,
me,
right?
this is yeah. This I think this is the weakest role player, just because I'm not sure that it's pushing out any cards that exist. But
Strange. Like, say someone asked you a year ago or whatever that you could pull at instant speed your what's it called, your hive mind, right? Like your super important
yeah,
virus
yeah,
pieces, and that deck doesn't really exist right now, but it sounds appealing.
yeah.
Weird how that's different right now. All right, we got one more criminal card. This is Info Bounty. It's a unique job resource, so that helps with ads, I reckon. But the first time each turn a run on your mark ends, you gain 2 credits if you breach that server during that run. This is actually really comparable to a card that's been around for a really long time, which is security testing. Security testing costs 0, and it lets you not a mark, because this only runs on your mark. It will identify your mark if you don't have one, but you can pick a server, and the first time a turn you run that server, you can't breach it, but you get 2 credits instead. This works with the same timing, sort of. You get the money after the run. That's actually a really important distinction to some other cards that can pay you out before the run, but it does not replace your access, which is really quite good. The idea that you can run archives and then actually get a bunch of other triggers, or run HQ, actually see a card and get 2 from it, is like comparable to a Cheswa, except you get the money in your pocket as opposed into your coffee cup. I
Yeah,
think
and this
you,
doesn't cost MU or
yeah.
anything like Chesva does, so it's pretty reasonable.
Have you played this one?
I again, I've only tested Corp so far, but I played like 4 out of my 5 games were against criminals. So like I saw a
Oh,
ton of info bounty. Everyone was on info bounty. It was also super bugged on jnet, where once you got the info bounty, it gave you the 2 credits on every other access step you got for the rest of the turn. So
it's
it was
good.
really good there until someone in the chat pointed out that error to me, and I was like, oh yeah, that's why the criminal is on 20 credits on turn 3, having played 2 cards. But
So
no, I like yeah.
yeah,
This is like a really like secretly this probably costs 0 because you're playing this on the turn that you can run the mark for free already.
yeah.
Um, so it like it's and that's assuming you're playing it in Sable, because I don't think you really play this outside of Sable or outside of having a whole bunch of other marks probably.
Yeah, that's always been a question mark. Lol, Mark. When we talked about Mark, this idea, would you see it outside of Sable? We haven't seen that to date. And while we've got a bunch more Mark support, I'm honestly not sure we're going to see it yet. The big thing with Sable is that, like, if your mark is a bad mark and you're running it for something like Info Bounty or to Virtuoso or whatever, at least it's clickless, right? Like, that's kind of the beauty. And I don't think we've seen any runner that can generate that consistent value on mark the way that Sable can. So that's a bit of a bummer that the mark cards are kind of a bit more forced, and we're seeing sabotage spill outside of ESSA, so I think that's interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like in a game, if you're running your mark consistently, this is definitely going to pay off. And it's a very easy card to include. You really don't have to change your deck at all.
Yeah, I think that like this, like it makes the runs against this makes your archive marks like actually pretty fine.
Yeah.
If you're clicklessly gaining 2 credits as a floor is pretty good. Dripping like that makes this an infinite daily cast that you can offset on the turn you install it, and then it makes all your central runs sort of not. It gives you a 2 credit rebate, right, on all of
That's
your
good.
central runs.
Right,
Yeah,
like it's no red team, am I right? But for real though, the idea that you can, and I think honestly consider playing red team, but like the idea that you can play Chesva, and then even if you have to pay money to get your run, and that was like the big falling of like on what's it called, security testing, is that as soon as everything was iced up and you actually had to pay money to make the run, it got really ugly. And at least this continues to scale because you still get your access. So the idea is that you can like wake and plan R&D and get paid. Like you're never locked out. I like that.
Yeah, I think this is a quietly much better card than much better is maybe a little strong, but this is a better card than security testing, and I expect like we'll see it. And I like to me this feels like the one of the boost to Sable over the other criminals that you could play is really this card. And it's a little bit quiet to be a boost for Sable alone, but it might be enough. Like I think her gaining a click every turn is quite impactful, and the more successful run of triggers you stack, the more impactful that gets.
This is neither here nor there, but I know going into the Crown of Servers tournament Worlds, I was trying to play an Apocalypse criminal deck, and I was meant to play Sable. And then I realized every time I play Sable, people ice up everything so well. And that's my least favorite part about Sable. While that's good for you, it's if everyone's icing everything up, I can't make cheap free runs, so please stop. I think this is an archetype roleplay because I don't think you're going to see it outside of Sable, but it's really good in Sable.
Yeah. I think this is better than Tunnel Vision pretty easily. I'm not sure it's better than that. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Let's do that. And that's the criminal cards. I do think that some of the strongest cards we've seen so far are definitely the criminal stuff. And it's like, again, when I saw the spoilers, I was not excited. That's because they do things that we've seen before, but that's a really safe bet for us because we know they're good cards because they're mimicking really good cards we've seen before. So I'm pretty comfortable with a lot of these placements at least. But more Sable support's really cool. Sable's really fun to play.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's just really good boosts for every criminal, basically. So
yeah. Cool. You want to dive into Shaper?
Let's do it.
I'm so excited for you to talk about this one because I know what you think about Concerto, and this is like the closest thing we have to Concerto. It's Spark of Inspiration. So much of the art in this set is just people with their legs up on desks. This is the runner version. Mod event costs 3. You set aside cards from the top of your stack face up until you find a program. You're installing that program at reduction of 10, which installs every program in the game for free, and then everything else just gets shuffled back. It costs 3 influence, and again, costs 3, I guess. YOLO. How hard do you have to build around this card? How hard do you have to build around this card? Can you just play it in every Shaper that doesn't play SMC?
So I think that's the thing is if you're playing this, you're committing to playing a no SMC Shaper.
Yeah.
And which is really like, I've seen Lost Geek already post a Spark deck that was running a single program, which you can probably guess what that program's going to be.
Oh yeah.
But there's probably some world where you play 3 big programs, a big fractor, a big decoder, and a big killer. And then you just hope that you draw your 3 sparks before you draw those programs.
And there's other ways to do it. Like you can cheat it out. You can like test run, you can rejig. There's ways to like make sure that if the deck doesn't draw right, it doesn't fail the game.
But once I'm paying 2 cards and 6 credits to cheat out a 4, 5, 6, maybe a 10 cost program,
maybe
my return is a little bit lower. It's funny. I think if this I would not mind turn 1 Spark of Inspiration installing Rozeki, right? I think that's that would be totally fine because it wasn't. I think by the end people was SMC for a turn 1 Rozeki is only good against particular corpse.
Yes.
And that would be 4 credits and stuff. But it's you're gonna see. I mean, Spark of Inspiration kind of stuff is it feels like a fun meme card. But there's definitely a couple of payoffs, including one we're going to talk about later. So
I think also it's really good in Shaper because Shaper has the ability to pull their programs from their deck. They're not often running multiples, and that's like where this gets really ugly. Is like when you find the same card you already installed, especially when it comes to programs. Another issue with Shaper cards is like a lot of Shaper decks, like we talked about with Hush, or I think like Misdirection's the best example, have not only cheap cards but situational cards. So like you can't just jam this into a deck where you spark on turn 2 and get a Misdirection against HB. Like that's a disaster. So you can build around it. I do think the single program deck is actually a fascinating idea, and we saw a lot of support for it in this set itself. But I don't know. If you install something that
Yeah,
costs 2 or 3, that's okay, I guess. It's just you don't know what you're
yeah.
getting.
Yeah, I think this is support for a type of shaper build we haven't seen for quite a while, which is like a minimal rig, kind of a little more aggressive shaper that
Yeah.
like just plays enough programs to play no nonsense. And I think always the biggest question with that is like, well, but I could probably do that in Crim or Anarch and have a little bit of a better faction pool for that. But maybe we'll see. And then if you like your big rig that's like, hey, I'm gonna have just big programs, then this is a great card for you.
Can you compare it to Gachapon? It kind of has some Gachapon energy to it. Not the best comparison, but like it's weird. You can compare it, I guess.
I mean, Eureka is where my mind goes, but
Yeah, that's not a good comparison. At least Spark looks great. Where are we going? It's a role player. I think.
okay.
Yeah, I think so.
If it's a role player, I think it's below. My goodness, you've Ashma no
Ausmund. Ausmund Pula.
Asmund
Yeah.
to put that. Yeah,
Yeah, I do think it's just inconsistent, but I do believe that if Shaper players can figure out a deck archetype or a deck which will look radically different than what Shaper plays right now, it is a very good card. It does a lot for what it costs. It's just you have to make that consistent, which is going to take a lot of creative deck building.
I'm going to go on the record and say I would probably put this in niche if it was my list only, but
All right, here we go. Yeah, I'm fine with that. You don't have to hide your feelings. Okay, cool. Hippocampic Mechanocytes. This is our first Shaper Cybernetic. It costs nothing. It gets 2 power counters on it when you install it. You do take a meat damage, and you can charge this. You just get +1 hand size for each hosted power counter on it. It's like pretty straightforward for a card. It costs 2 influence, which is very, very splashable. And this is the best plus hand size we have. I'd say it's the best plus hand size we have in the game right now.
I think I would agree. Yeah,
Yeah.
I think this outclasses T400 by pretty comfortably.
So it's just worth saying to make sure we're on the same page. Why plus hand size, right? So plus hand size is useful because you have more cards in hand, but it's largely not played for that. It's not like Shapers need to hold 6 cards in hand or 7 cards in hand to pull off some combo. This is not like, I guess, what I imagine Yu-Gi-Oh to be like. It's more so that the more cards you have in hand, the better you can interact with certain like combos. If corporations can consistently do a 6 damage burst from like 2 punitive counter strikes or a 7 damage burst with things like boom, there's just a reason to keep your hand size up. Again, it's not about like the possibilities, it's more about survival. And we saw classically back in the day, like there were a lot of metas where people would play really boring, really generic damage protection cards just because if you didn't have them by the early to mid game, you could lose the game. And this technically fits in that slot. I'd argue that we don't need it. It's not a meta that requires this. I don't think I'm putting this into my deck unless I'm like really worried about something or I want to inherently play cybernetics. But I think a card for a meta that it's going to be a very good card if you feel like you need hand size because you have to deal with like 3 out of 6 meta decks really make you care about it.
Yeah, this feels like NSG doing a spin on something like a Plastrate Carapace, where they want you to invest in it like a little bit more, but you get some actual game benefit from installing it. Because yeah, usually having extra hand size is like all of the attributes to have. It's probably the least important one. Like there's a reason we've never seen a runner with plus hand size. It's just not that relevant for runners. But it's not bad, and it does allow you to take more core damage, and it does allow you like, hey, if someone in your meta is playing Thule like every single week, yeah, slot one of these in, you'll have a slightly nicer time against them overall. So like this is a tech card, and it's a perfectly reasonable tech card that doesn't come down. It does require a little bit of work to really like the most damage you're probably seeing in a single turn is probably 8 from 2 ends of the line, so you probably need to charge this once in that case.
Yeah.
But
I do think against that, there's better ways to attack against that one specifically.
Yeah, potentially, for sure.
Yeah. So I was playing this a bit in startup, and specifically, as you mentioned, I was playing Essa, and I was taking a lot of core damage. I want to see how much core damage I could take, and I wasn't playing charge targets, but this plus Marrow means like you can take a lot of core damage, like an absurd amount of core damage, which is it's good fun. And 2 influence, it's like very doable.
Yeah, I think this is another a good shout out for Essa, just letting you go for 2 more cards, and the meat damage is pretty inconsequential even in startup Anarch. So
Yeah.
yeah.
Cool. I think this is inherently like a niche card. I don't think anybody needs it, but if you need it, it's not bad for what it does.
Yeah, so this isn't core to S's deck building. She just doesn't really need it and has other options
Yeah.
when plotting in. So like this is gonna fit in that niche pretty comfortably,
Where
or
are
in
we
the
putting
niche
it?
slot pretty comfortably.
It's also like worth noting that if you're worried about hand size, this is directly competing with Log Vault or Stone Chit Chart Room, which like that's a hot card right now. So yeah, it's not what we all call it. It's happened. Where we want to put this? Like, I don't know.
I guess to the right. I mean, I would say to the right of Hush, but I could see arguments to the right of Poison Vial as well.
Yep, I think you're gonna see more Poison Vial. Hush, for what it's worth, like it does something unique, and this card doesn't exactly, which is that's cool. Okay. I think we have our last cybernetic of the set, if I'm not mistaken. This is Basilar Synth Clan. It's a cybernetic. When you install this, suffer 2 core damage. It's worth noting ESA only triggers the first time you take any amount of core damage. So, whoops. You get an extra click for each of your turns. Okay, Jeff, I know you like this card. I will say, when I first saw this card, I thought, I got Beth. I'm good. Which is, I guess, a problem with standard. In the standard format, getting an extra click a turn is like obviously an absurdly good ability, but there's a really easy way to do it in the standard format with Beth Kilrain Shank, a unique 2 credit a resource. While she doesn't consistently give a click, you can kind of build a deck that does kind of encourage that. At least she does something. Why is a click good? Deep dive. Just having clicks is good inherently, but I do think, Jeff, I'm guessing you're in the just take 2 core damage. I don't care what deck I'm playing camp. Is that right?
Yeah, basically, to me, it's my experience with this primarily in playtesting was if I'm not playing up against a kind of like 1,000 cuts or like consistently damaging deck,
Yeah.
this just becomes a tech card that just means my deck is 25% better than it should be.
Yeah, that's a lot.
That's it's like playing this against an HB deck just feels like cheating. Like it's just like, oh, I'm gaining so much advantage for you. And generally Shaper decks are built to play this kind of efficiency game that's pretty click intensive. And so getting an extra click in just puts you so much further ahead of the corp than you normally are struggling to just keep up. So I'm pretty high on this card. And this would be the one reason I'd maybe say, oh, we might see a little more hippocampic mechanocytes, because you install these 2 cards and you're back to being, you're basically just a regular 5-click runner at that point.
Yep. And Shapers classically were honest for a long time. They were defined by the fact that they were taking in just about every game 1 or 2 core damage. Back in the day with Stimhack, it was a card that said to make a run, gain 9 credits for that run. At the end of the run, take a core damage. And Shapers played that just so they could self-modifying code their breakers on the table at absurd reductions of rates. So Shapers are very, very functional at low hand size. It gets a bit more tricky again if you're doing like a deep dive deck. If you're doing something like that, again, you have to be a bit matchup dependent, but at least it's not a big slot in your deck if you don't install it, right? Like it's not, you don't have to build around it, which is quite cool. So yeah, I agreed. It's worth mentioning this, and I think we've said this before, the fact that Tule comes out on one side of the set, and then on the other side, they give all the cards that like encourage runners to like core damage themselves is kind of twisted to me, but I think that's one of the matchups where you might not want to play this one.
Potentially, yeah. Or maybe you just say, you know what? I dare you to beat me here. And
I'll just clot out the
say,
ontologicals. You'll be fine.
Yeah. I'll clot out the ontologicals. I'll deep dive them away. I don't know.
So a weird thing with this card, and again, I'll be interested to hear your take about this, but if you're not familiar, core damage is what brain damage used to be called, and Null Signal Games has renamed it. And I'm a big fan of that. There's a lot more effects that now can do this sort of like permanent damage as it is. And I think the fact that this might be renamed to core damage as opposed to brain damage might make certain players less afraid of taking it. Like it just seems less scary. I don't know. Do you agree with that?
I think that's true. I think one of the lessons that was always you had the hardest time convincing people of when they were playing old school Netrunner was that like, yeah, the cost of stim hack is really not a cost.
Yeah.
And calling it core damage rather than the older term, I think is like actually helps drive that lesson home and might lead to people realizing that some of these core damage cards are a little busted.
Yeah. They're meant to be good. They're meant to be quite good. And I do think this is one of them. Do you think that you would play Shaper deck without this going forward?
I think this is probably a 1x in every Shaper deck I'm building until I end up in a meta where I discover that I'm never installing this.
So that's all the way up there, huh?
Yeah, I think so.
Awesome. Okay, cool. Well, hey, it's Back to the Future. We're going to 88 miles. Flux capacitor costs nothing. Takes up an MU though. It's another unique program. Love to see it. It's a Trojan, so it gets hosted on stuff. And it says the first time you break a subroutine during each encounter with the host dice, you may charge one of your installed cards. It costs only 2 influence, which is like totally playable. Now, we've seen just about every faction actually has reasons that they want to charge their own cards, put power counters on their cards. Even on a very basic level, we have Earthrise Hotel, which is actually one of the best charged counters, it turns out. This is a strange card. I think a lot of people during previous season called it Ultimate Card 46. That to me is surprising. That term means like the card that's the 46th best card in your deck that gets cut down to 45 for consistency's sake. I do think the fact that this just like interacts with endurance and it's not once, it's each time. I'm really scared of this thing.
I think this card has some really. I think the reason people call this the 46th card is because it compares really closely to Cubon or Kyuban, which is a card that is my profile picture. It's one of my favorite Shaper cards, and it is perpetually the 46th card in the list. And you know, Flux Capacitor bears a lot of those same kind of qualities, where it's like, yeah, if all I'm getting is 2 credits and like an Earthrise counter is 2 cards, which is not quite 2 credits, but not so different from 2 credits, right? Or it's a propeller counter, which is 2 credits, or a endurance subroutine, which is a whole different deal. Like, I think that's where this card's just looking more interesting, is because the value of a charge counter is a lot more variable and situational, but that then gives it a higher ceiling than 2 credits, which are always 2 credits and are sort of locked in at the value of 2 credits.
Yeah. How can you abuse this? Because like obviously the best thing you can do here is break something as cheap as possible as often as you can. So like no joke, do you ever flux capacitor something and just tremolo through it a bunch for free just to like charge a boat? Like I don't think that the corp is going to allow you to do that for that long, but like if you can break this, like this is infinite boat.
Yeah, I think this is almost more a Dow card than a Padma card, so that you can really punish the corp for resing a weak piece of ice, and you can charge up your endurance. You can charge up a wake implant. I think is actually one of the cards I really like to see with this, where I can now, if they put a weaker ice on HQ, yeah, I can just boom grab 2 power counters on every HQ run and turn those into 2 R&D accesses. That seems pretty nice.
Yeah. I don't know. I think that the charge is actually like quite valuable. And maybe again, like you mentioned how endurance is his own thing, but like any card that can support endurance is obviously like worth warping the meta around to some extent. Like just about all the competitive decks for the last season or so were just endurance delivery vehicles, and this thing is a battery for the delivery vehicle. Like
yeah, I'm going to go on a very brief tangent. Is by the very last major tournament, the runners were almost evenly split between endurance and not endurance runners. So I think we're at UK Nationals. And so I think we're starting, and especially I actually think in Parhelion now, there's more cards that you might want to spend influence on that aren't endurance that also give you increased odds to win the game. So I'm optimistic that we're going to see a little bit less endurance outside of Shaper, but we may not. You know, it might just be that, hey, yeah, now I just play Wake in Criminal, and that makes it easier for me to splash endurance rather than harder. So that's a separate tangent about an unrelated topic to some extent.
So we're talking about playing this out of faction. I think it's maybe possible. I think it's difficult. I think one of the best things in Shaper is that obviously you have simul trips, so you can move this around and replace it and uninstall it, reinstall it, stuff like that. You can pawn shop it. You have a lot of flexibility. We'll talk about some other cards coming up, but yeah, I don't know. I don't know if I'd play this in Criminal that quickly, especially because MU is a bit tight. But in Shaper, you have a lot of good charge counters.
Yeah, I think it's hard to play out of faction, not so much because of the influence cost, but because you can't necessarily find it in time. And the MU cost ends up being pretty big as well. So I'm a little bit sad that we don't see any kind of out of faction, any easily splashable charge. And this is probably the closest we're going to see.
Yeah. We got to see if we need to reevaluate Dag at some point. Maybe. Where are we putting this thing? I think it's an archetype role player.
Yeah, I think so.
How good is it though? It's a bit of a mystery to me.
It is. I think. Yeah, actually, I think there's probably fine. The more we move Katorga Breakout down,
I know that one's feels like it's becoming the wrong way.
I feel like that one's probably gonna slide back over, but I think that's pretty. Let's start there.
Okay, cool. All right, we got not our last AI, our second last AI. This is Nanook. It's a 2 MU, 4 cost for this thing. It's not unique, so you can play as many of these as you want. But when this program is uninstalled, just remove it from the game. So you can't recur this thing. And it says when agenda is scored or stolen, also remove this from the game. It can't be recurred. It's 3 strength, 1 for 1, sorry, base 3 strength, 1 for 1 additional strength, and it's 2 for 2 subroutines. It's a big old 5 influence. Now, classically, No Signal Games has printed some banger 5 influence shaper cards. How banger is the bear?
I think medium to high banger.
So how do you play this? Obviously, like looking at this thing, it's a really good AI breaker. It's actually some of the best numbers on a card that can break all types of ice in the game, but it has some huge downsides. Turns out agendas are, well, they're going to be in the game, right? You're trying to steal them generally to win the game. They're trying to score them to usually win the game. So this is a bit of a liability. Now, back in the day, you were able to build around this with cards like Film Critic, things that interacted with agendas without stealing them. But modernly, I think it's just imp or bust, right?
I think it's imp and Stargate or bust.
Oh, Stargate, yeah, huge.
Yeah, so like that's the thing. I think this card could be used in 2 ways. I think there's a way where you can just say, I'm going to find a way to make Nanook be my only breaker for the whole game. So I'm going to run 3 copies. I'm going to use Imp. I'm going to use Stargate. And I'm going to try to just get 7 points in archives, get rid of all the spin doctors, and then win the game all in one go. Yeah. I think there's also variants that lean a little less hard into it, where it's like, I'm going to play Apocalypse, and I'm just going to cross my fingers real hard that I don't see an agenda before I've broken all the ice on central servers.
Yeah, or you play like replacement effects, right? Which Shaper doesn't have a lot of those for centrals, but like if you're never accessing, you can't steal.
Yeah, that's true. You might play a tech security testing, and then just put it on a central server so that you avoid the access. That's kind of cute. But I think the other thing this does is this card, like its base strength is really good for early remote contests, or just like maybe not early remote, but just like the mid game remote contest. So you can play a really, really slow and a really greedy control shaper. And then like in particular in Cabinet Wu, you can pull this out in the mid game, break through that remote server. And then, yeah, it goes away, but that's fine. It did the job of getting you where you need to go. And unlike Mayfly, it doesn't get stuffed by stuff like Border Control or Zato Grid, or any of these ways that corps have of forcing you to run back to the same server multiple times.
Yeah, I'm super stoked with this in Cabinet Wu. If you can make the call, again, I don't know if we're going to have any exposed, but if you know when to run, again, flame out if you need to. And this is going to get removed from the game anyways at the end of the turn if you're not doing anything super cute with Cabinet. But just a 3 credit, like ridiculous breaker, right? Like, I'm not going to name ice that you're not exactly seeing on the remote server, but like Drafter for 2, great. Magnet for 2, yeah, you'll see that. Fairchild 3 is like 4 credits, or 4 credits and probably a card, or something like that, maybe 6 credits. Seems good. I think this is nice.
Yeah. I mean, like Ansel is like arguably a bad matchup, and you're still breaking that for 5, which is pretty good.
Yeah, no, I think this is neat. And I think it's actually like is worth building around. I don't think it's going to be the best competitive shaper, but I think the power of this card is going to attract players to actually try and warp it, because it is appealing.
And I think, I think the more powerful use is in that kind of lock shaper, and that you play 1 or 2 of these to just bust open the remote when the corp tries to kind of rush you out, because this does work so well as a kind of soft economy card in addition to being an AI breaker.
So this wasn't the case for the card before, but having Adam S. Doyle draw more AI animals is fantastic. The dogs art, I think, is even potentially better, but they're both very, very good. Damn.
No, the dog is, I think, the stronger piece of art, but that's
we'll do a different tier list. But yeah, oh man, Doyle, fantastic. Where are we putting this? I don't think it's exactly a faction staple. I don't think every shaper deck's going to play it, but it's kind of on the cusp of it.
To me, this could go in faction staple, but I think it's okay to put it high in archetype role player, but this does feel like a faction staple. I might put it above Bankar and Tremolo.
Yeah, that tracks. Yeah, I'm cool with that. Are you okay with that?
Yeah.
All right.
I proposed that position, so I sure hope so.
This is the biggest animal we have. It costs 10. It's the most expensive program in the whole game. It's 2 MU. It's a killer whale. First time each turn this program fully breaks a piece of ice, you may charge 1 of your installed cards. It costs 2 to break any subroutines on sentries, and then 2 for 3 strength. It is 3 strength and only 2 influence. Oh, wow. This was actually previewed, I think, pretty early in spoiler season as a really divisive card. June was talking a long time ago, I think during, it was like a ShadowNet podcast when Midnight Sun was coming out, talking about how there's a 10 strength program that was like meant to be a central part, or maybe I'm making that part up, but like I know it's mentioned.
It wasn't like it was I think what she said was that it was like the inspirational theme was this idea of really big number shaper cards. Not that it was the core build around of the whole set.
Right on. Okay, so that makes a bit more sense, I think. But this is massive. On its own, it also supports a lot of the stuff that shapers are modernly doing, right? Like endurance is obviously another incredibly expensive card. Can you put so many of those in a single deck? But if you're using your Orca to charge your endurance, it's obviously a lot better. I think you need to get value from the power, the charge of this. Otherwise, it's just definitely not worth 10 credits. That being said, before I think we might talk about some negatives of this, the fact that it can deal with mid-range, like the 3 strength, like the drafter, litmus test is really quite rare for Shaper. Shaper sometimes struggles with the mid-range sentries, and they generally don't have a lot of good ways to deal with it. And this is technically the most efficient, but like, it sure has heck hope it was. It's 2 MU and it costs 10 credits. Like, why? Why wouldn't it be? What do you think about this?
Yeah,
I don't
like
I don't think this is playable for what it's worth.
Do I think this is playable? Do I think this is playable without my no?
I don't know what that means.
I mean, I think this card is okay.
Okay.
I think it's very hard to justify putting down for 10, but I think it actually is like pretty like when you get it down, I think you'll be pretty happy it's on the table. Because there's basically breaking every sentry in the game for 2 or 4 credits. Not literally every sentry. There's a couple that you're going to break for 6.
Realistically, though, every sentry.
Yeah, I think even I was about to say like Hydra is like strength 6, isn't it?
Yeah, with your kind, you're good. It's Archer for 4.
Yeah.
Like all the big stuff it passes.
Yeah, there's like a very small handful of ice that doesn't break for 4. So like that said, unless you have to also get value out of that charge, but you're Shaper. You've got a lot of valuable charge targets, basically no matter what you're. I mean, by the time you get this down, your rig's going to have charge targets in it, right? This is like, never going to be the first card you install.
It's so weird because, okay, firstly, Spark of Inspiration means that you can play this for 3 credits. How consistently can you do that? Do you test run this to spark it? Probably not worth the time and effort. But if it hits, you're obviously in a good spot. But like, we're in a world right now where every shaper is paying 8 credits for a boat. And the boat, it's pretty obvious at this point, it's like a ridiculously powerful card that solves a lot of problems and gives you aggression. Now, if there was no boat, obviously that changes the value of the Orca's charging ability, which I think the boat can get a lot of value from. But is that the card that could take that slot? Because I just don't see how I can install 18 cost worth of cards. Like, that seems near impossible.
I mean, if it's 18 cost of cards and now you break every sentry for 4 and then every other card you get to break, like getting a whole extra endurance counter basically is a whole extra piece of ice you can break every turn, right? It goes from the endurance being able to break an ice every other turn to being able to break an ice every turn. And that's a huge change in how you think about your whole kind of economy and game flow. So the ceiling on this card, I think, is pretty reasonably high, but 10 costs is like, I mean, there's just no getting around it. It's such an expensive card to only break one type of ice.
Do you? I love how the art of this, and like this is Yakuza art. This is generally different than Yakuza's style that I see on the corp cards. This like mimics what's it called, Leviathan, in the terms of posing and like the kind of splash it's making. And Leviathan is basically this card, but for code gates, but somehow even worse. Yeah, I don't know. I'm not into this one. I don't realistically see myself installing this for 10 in a boat meta, but I do agree. Like if I can just imagine away the cost, this is like very, very, very good.
Yeah, and I mean it's interesting to me because I'm like, oh, you know what? If I use this to get like, if I can charge an environmental testing or 2 with this, suddenly I've paid off all that I've got, and like that's another niche card and yada yada. But like, I'll be interested to see. My sense is runners make more money than we think they do, and paying a 10 cost is maybe going to be worth it for some decks.
Infinite Propeller, Jeff. Isn't that cool?
I'm a huge Propeller stan.
I know. Okay, where do you want to put this boat? Like, I honestly don't think it's like
we can put it
I
in
think
niche.
it's unplayable.
I think that's okay.
But do you actually
think it's unplayable?
I think it's on play. Not like shame.
Oh,
Like
okay.
I don't think it's shame, but I do think it would be like middle niche. But I think you might think it's end of archetype.
I would probably put it at end of archetype, but I think putting it in niche is pretty reasonable. You can put it to the right of hippocampic. I think.
Whoa. Okay. Okay. Okay.
I 10 costs is a lot for just a sentry breaker. Like 8 costs that breaks anything makes lots of sense. 10 costs to
Yeah.
break sentries, that's a harder sell.
Yeah. We'll see if people can spark it out. Okay. Not our last yet. This is a Shaper program. It's K2CP Turbine. It's 4 to install. It's not unique, which is kind of a fun interaction with this one. 1MU gives you a program that just says each installed non-AI icebreaker gets +2 strength. It's 4 influence, which is a lot. And this is actually a card that I think a lot of factions start at Bossel would really consider splashing for a lot of reasons. We've seen this is really cool. We've seen so much Anarch cards that lower the strength of ice, and then we've seen a bunch of Shaper cards that raise the strength of other stuff. And I think raising strength is technically less potentially problematic. Generally, all the lower strength stuff interacts with ice destruction, which at some points in the game has been problematic. But just buffing your breakers, having a flat buff, like you can compare this to Ice Carver. Ice Carver brings -1. This is +2 to everything. Kind of works the same. Which one do you want to play for your deck? Kind of big question.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is weird. I think this is a better in startup card because the way that interacts with like Anarch fixed strength breakers is kind of nonsense. You're breaking stuff for really, really, really cheap. But I worry in Shaper, which is like, it's a lot of endurance right now, whether this is worth a slot.
Yeah, I think someone else put it best of this card is broken in a meta that we're not in.
Yeah.
Right? Like there's metas where if the corpse are all glacier, like this card is just the most like this is an economy card at a certain point. You just slap this down and you're saving yourself like 2-4, like you're just making so much money off of this K2CP turbine. I don't think we're quite in that meta at the moment. I think like against like a PD deck, you just don't have time. And against there's enough corps that are going with like high subroutine ice that you're not quite getting the payout on this. But like I think this card's actually kind of scary as the court player, especially if you go and look and you're like, oh, Buzzsaw's 1 influence,
Yes.
Cleaver's 2 influence. For 3 influence, Shaper breaks every 5 strength ice in my deck for nothing. Like
I
5
think
strength or lower.
Buzzsaw's the one that like immediately gets me. I'm seeing a lot of people playing fixed strength breakers right now. I'm testing on like S and stuff. I think for startup, this is a really big thing. And like that deck, once it has, it's sweet. And like classically, it was like Ice Carver and Leech, and this is more direct. Admittedly, it's it's a lot of influence, a lot of money, but like Buzzsaw, Cleaver, like you deal with everything for pennies, like literally pennies. Like ice just stops being relevant when this hits the table.
Yeah. No, I mean, yeah. That said, this does cost 4. It costs an MU. So like it's really good at dealing with the ice game, and that's the only thing it solves. So you have to be in a meta that's really heavily about ice, but then this card is really maybe the best we've in class for basically anything of this type of effect we've seen in Netrunner. So
I think you mentioned on Daily Cast that this didn't always say non-AI icebreaker, which like, yeah, thanks for that. That's probably for the best, huh?
Yeah. Let's go with my 2 and 4 strength Amakua.
Yeah, let's yikes. Okay.
Oh boy.
I think this card's potentially really good. I agree with you. I don't think it's good right now. I don't think I'd want to put into niche because it's like totally reasonable. But I don't think
I
you're
know
gonna see a lot of play.
It's weird where I'm like, I think this is a faction staple, but it's not in the meta we're in. So like,
No.
we're like Katorga Breakout, we're evaluating the exact same fashion. We're like, this card's busted in some metas and not in others, and so maybe that's just where we put this, like in that archetype role player slot.
Yeah, but like, I don't know. It's hard to evaluate because again, like I don't think it's playable right now, but I do think when it is, it's like a phenomenal card.
What I will say is I think the next card that we're going to talk about increases the playability of this card really significantly. So that's why I would say I might move this to the left, like just to the right, or even like to the right of Reprise, I think,
Cool,
for me,
okay.
because I think we're going to see this in World Tree decks a ton.
It's really funny. You said like the playability of this card scales up with World Tree. The playability of every card scales up with World Tree. If it's not an event, it scales up World Tree. This is World Tree. Man, what a card. It costs 6, which is really expensive. We've seen a lot of very good expensive stuff recently. Takes 2 MU. It's deep net subtype. That's new. It says the first time each turn you make a successful run, you may trash one of your installed cards, other installed cards, mind you, to search your stack for one card of the same type. Install that card, paying 3 less. This is only 4 influence, which to me is pretty surprising, but I guess I'm happy about that. This is the card I'm most excited in all of this entire set. It is just absolutely nonsense powerful for so many reasons, and it's also very interesting because it's a very flexible. It's like one of those big brain type cards. It allows you to pull the right card when you need it at instant speed. But I think maybe my favorite thing on top of that is actually requires interaction. I'm kind of tired of shaper cards just sitting back and like building board states. This requires you to run to make successful runs. Like, sure, you can pull out your 2-cost Proco from your deck. That's now a 1 of. You can pull out all your tech cards, your like DJ Fenris consistently. You can pull out your damage, your net damage, your core damage prevention. You can pull out your imp before you access to get, you know, a value, and then you get rid of it. This is the card that why I've been saying I'm upset that all these other cards say that they trash themselves when they're empty. That's the one maybe downside to World Tree is that currently in the modern meta, there's not that many empty batteries for this thing, and this card needs batteries. It needs cards like Cash, which don't exist in Standard. They need cards like Imp, which have done something and they're empty. They need cards kind of like Daily Cast that can have 2 credits on them left, and then you don't mind making it into literally anything else into your deck. I am so happy about this card. This is massively powerful. I kind of worry about it because the fact that you can give Shaper the ability to pull just about anything from their deck in any matchup is an absolute nightmare, right? Like you're playing a damage archetype and on turn 1, they can get their Caldera consistently. Like what? How? I can't deal with that. Like, I don't know what to do.
No, I mean, this is the card where I'm like, this might just be this set's crowdfunding. Like, it's just an incredibly fun card. Everyone enjoys playing with it, and everyone agrees it is just too busted to survive. Like, that might just be what this card does. I'm like quietly optimistic that like there's enough tricky things to keep this in line, and enough weird program trashes that people are like have to play a little carefully. But this card's wild. It is a lot of fun to play, and it is got this like incredibly high ceiling of how creative can you be in deck building, and to some extent, how many cards can you fit in your deck?
Yes, you're saying the big decks like the Cabinessa 60 or whatever, and saying like it still feels fine, right? Like you get your World Tree down, it basically is a whole toolbox. This is the first card, barring maybe Daily Business Show, that I would consider playing online with a deck tracker. Because remembering everything that's in your deck is incredibly important. Good thing on JNet is that when you make a run and you already trash your resources, it shows you all your resources. Because like I don't remember what's in there anymore. It's been a bit, but especially your Nova deck. We'll get to that in a bit. Massive, just like unbelievably powerful. I have full confidence that at some point this is going to get banned because it is just nonsense. It is way too good and way too fun.
Yeah, it's you know, like I'm glad this card exists. I feel like this could cost 10 and still be on the margins of playable.
Yeah. Slow down a bit, but like if you're scared about this, if you think this is Shaper nonsense, it doesn't have to be. Like you can just use this to cycle daily casts. I just try it out is all I'm saying. If you're watching this and you're not a Shaper player, import this in just basically anything, right? Like import this in Apex and you can get around Apex's ability. I think you have to play that thing that blanks your ability during a run.
Yeah, I was actually going to shout that out is you can play direct access, which turns off your ID ability. Go and trash a resource and get your Aesops installed, and that's the easiest way to ever install an Aesops in any in Apex deck. So now you just find some other. Yeah, you tutor it, and now you just find some reason to play Apex. So the payoff once you get that going is maybe not the best, but well, then again, maybe you can complement that with a reverse setup, and now you're drawing, installing, and cycling. So who knows? Maybe you can make that work.
This thing, half of it works really well with Harbinger. It's quite nice if you have an engine. But yeah, this thing is just really good. Aesops, even in Shaper, it works. I think Anarch, you can play this potentially with virus decks that have empty viruses that they want to move and reinstall. Maybe you're playing Agostina more on tempo. Wow.
There's already been someone posting an Atom list that just uses emergent creativity, starts selling off its directives into daily casts. Just to get the engine rolling.
Human or whatever the dream is there, I guess. phenomenal. On top of man being, right? Like this is gonna get banned. There's no
Yeah.
way it's not.
No, this card is definitely getting banned. I don't know how we slept on this as playtesters, but we'll see. We'll see.
So good. Next up, it's our last shaper card. This is Dr. Nuka Vrolik, resource connection. It costs only one. You can only have one. When you install this resource, you load 2 power counters on it. When it's empty, trash it. Hate that sentence. Click for hosted power counter to draw 3 cards. It's 2 influence, so it's like on the cusp of splashing. So like,
if this card didn't trash itself, that'd be wild.
You just want a cache that draws cards. Let us have a cache that draws cards. So if you're doing the math here, right? Like we're spending 3 clicks and 1 credit to draw 6 cards. So you're basically 2 cards for a click. We're going to ignore the credit for some reason. That is comparable to stuff that already sees play. What's it called right now? Log Vault, Stone Chip Chart Room, that sees play. I gotta stop saying that. It's going to probably confuse people. Stone Chip Chart Room definitely sees play. The benefit of Stone Chip Chart Room is that you can choose to fire it at whenever you want. So it's damage prevention. It lets you out of a lot of tough spots. But a click to draw 2 cards at a minimum is like niche playable. But I do think that's a very big difference between this and the instant speed use of a Stone Chip.
I would say though, having a resource you can put down and just slam for 6 is a really big upside compared to something like Stone Chip. And like this compares not terribly even to something like Diesel, where if I play Diesel and then click to draw twice, I've only seen 5 cards versus this actually lets me go and see that 6th card. Now you're paying credit for that, and so you're probably not coming out like you're trading a card for a credit basically in that case. But I don't think that's the worst. And then the other thing you're going to say is, oh, if I'm going to install a resource to draw cards, why am I not installing Earthrise Hotel?
Yeah, exactly.
And I think I think it's like, yeah, Earthrise is going to clicklessly draw you many more cards than Vrolik is. Like, just there's no way around that math, right?
Well, you can charge this. It's worth noting, and you can also obviously charge your Earthrise Hotel, and one of them scales differently. But again, clickless card draw is a premium.
There's some decks that can be like, oh yeah, 2 cards a turn, that's all I need. But I think often that's not. Usually, you are going to spend that click to draw, even if you've got an Earthrise going in a lot of situations, especially in Shaper, I would say. And so then that costs maybe that. But I think that's maybe a little bit too. I think to me, the reason you would play this over Earthrise is because this comes down for 3 credits less, right?
Yeah.
So you're gonna say, you know what, I want the upfront cost to be low, and I'm happy to pay the click cost down the road as sort of my exchange. And I think once you charge this card just once, it becomes quite good in terms of its cost and payoff.
You've been seeing Earthrise consistently in Padma decks, and like sometimes those Padma decks are like they're at the point like if I don't run R&D this turn, I lose my Earthrise Hotel. And you don't exactly get that with Nuka. You do get it with Nuka where if you draw the last 3 cards of it, she's gone. So you lose it there. I do think one thing that's interesting about this is like the sort of on-demand ability about it is that you can like mass draw quickly and consistently. Like you can get this out of your hand and then in the future mass draw, which like maybe in a Banhar deck, like a deck that you're consistently emptying your hand, you really like the ability to be able to like in 2 clicks, I'm going to refill my hand, right? Like if we had something like Hippocampic and then we had, what was it called? Like Game Day or whatever that one was that says draw back up to your hand size. That's an effect that matters for certain decks. I'm not exactly sure why you need that in Shaper. Like maybe you need, there's other cards that said like trash cards from your hand to do something. Like if you have something that pays out for already starting your turn with like 8 or 9 cards, this might be a fast way to get there, or at least spend your first couple clicks getting there. It's strange.
I also do think that mention in Anarch is kind of interesting to me because I think you could think about splashing this where you were splashing Diesel out of faction. Yeah. Because it does the thing you want Diesel for, which is to draw cards, but it draws you more cards on net.
Yes, and when you want them too, which sometimes like you have a Diesel, you have an extra click on your turn, you're like, I don't want a Diesel now because I'm going to discard. It's kind of like the VR-cation problem, and this allows you to offshore.
Yeah, for sure.
It's weird. It's like on the cusp, but like the math isn't exactly there. Again, also to some extent, you can maybe compare the click compression of this to
verbal plasticity.
Exactly. Which that also comes down to like a click for 2 draw click to credit ratio or card to credit ratio, excuse me, card to click ratio. And that card sees no play, but I think that makes a lot of sense. This you can actually do something the turn it comes down.
I'm glad that we're not getting we're not getting draw that's just blanket better than other draw that's already in the game. It does mean it's hard to figure out exactly who runs this, what this displaces, but I'd be pretty surprised if this saw play in no decks, I guess.
Yeah, I'm actually interested to play that in Criminal. Like also if you have that with a class act, it's like draw 4, bottom 1. Like that's good. That's good value. It's also worth noting that it's unique, right? So if you play this in a Palace deck, not that it's really been a thing, it's another piece for that deck.
Paulus.
Coffee tribal, let's go.
Oh no, there's a good number of unique connections in this set, so you never know.
Not a lot of them make sense together, but this is like I think one of the most generic, like kind of just like Beth Kilrain Chang. You can play in any Shaper deck and not feel terrible about it.
Yeah, and this also saw like not to go too deep on Paula's, but Paula's does want lots of card draw, and hey,
yeah, you got it.
Here we are.
I dropped her into the middle. How do you feel? I don't feel really strongly about this one though.
Yeah, I think that's totally fine.
All right, cool. We only have 2 more. These are neutral runner cards. So this is what was promised, a neutral runner. So this is a standard legal neutral runner. This is Nova, and Nova is the same person. There's a really cool narrative here, but the same runner from Catalyst, from System Gateway. There's a whole story with the Managarm Skunkworks and finding the twin or whatever exactly the other part of Nova is here.
I hope you have someone put a clip up on your YouTube channel of you not believing the chat that this was Catalyst and just how many times it was said to you.
Read the card. Oh yeah, I'm not going to do that. Let's talk about Nova otherwise though. So we've talked about Ampere on the other side, which has very similar text, but you need to write a bit more about agendas. Now you have a 40 card minimum when you're building a Nova deck, which let me tell you, that's messed up. I don't understand how you're building a 40 card Nova deck when they give you the whole like, oh, you can play with any card you want, just pick 40. Like, nah, I'm playing a 58 card Nova deck, and I'm gonna feel bad about it. You got infinite influence, but you have to play Highlander. You only play 1 of each cards. This is a lot better than Ampere. I think Ampere has problems. We talked about it again. You can check out the video on Jeff's channel, but the problem is most corps need an identity to have like a focused game plan, to actually like do something and push them in a direction. So they need focus to win a game generally. Well, runners, you can just put all the best cards in a deck and slam centrals and you can win. You can win more often than not, as long as the tutor abilities exist in the format, as long as there's universal cards that you have access to, and your deck has a reasonable ratio between like card draw, tutoring, breakers, pressure, economy. As long as you hit all those fundamentals, a blank runner ID is like not the worst thing you can ask for. What do you think about Nova?
It is much better than Ampere, and it is very much not for me. And that's okay. Someone posted the hot take in Slack where like this card's gonna get banned, and like I don't see a world where that happens.
I would so I think Nova's not bad. I'm actually surprised that the Nova games I played have performed a bit better than I thought they would. Like surprisingly better. Like I would say like tier 1.5, tier 2 deck. And I thought it would be like Ampere level of, which is like very inconsistent. But my biggest problem with Nova is most of those decks have hinged on an early game in which I drew into an endurance or I drew into a world tree. And this is my biggest fear when it comes to Nova, is that I'm worried that Nova decks are actually okay to good. And if we start seeing at tournaments, like the Nova deck is basically a celebration of the most bannable cards in Netrunner, right? Like as soon as you get, you're taking basically the most overtuned cards from every faction and you're generally stitching them together because they're generally all good. Obviously not the huge build arounds. And so I think Nova might be an acceleration to like, I don't know. It's like, are you tired of endurance? It's another endurance runner. Are you like, you're going to get a hippo to this one too?
Yeah, I think like, hey, if you say that World Tree and Endurance are the most broken cards in the format, which I think is maybe an argument that you could make, and it's too early to really say, but there's an argument you could make for that, right? I don't know that Nova is going to use those better than a Shaper deck that can run 3x of all of the other support cards, right?
I agree.
And this is and probably has an ID ability as well. So it's just like I think Nova can be really good. Like I would not be surprised to see diehard Nova players, or not even diehard Nova players, but just people that like playing Nova doing pretty well with Nova.
I like playing Nova. I definitely do. And I don't think Nova is probably going to be better than anything that's more focused. But I do think that like Nova is just kind of like, there's a time when the most wanted list came out and said that these certain cards cost universal influence, and then the best decks just use that as a shopping list. And like Nova just feels like a shopping list. Like if you want to build an Anarch deck, just look at the Nova decks and play the Anarch cards they're playing. That's probably not a problem overall. It's just, to me, it's, I don't know. It feels kind of weird.
I think it's the like, there's going to be games where like, okay, great. I found my early World Tree. I found my early Hippo. I found my early Endurance. I gotcha. But I'm like, well, I could just play an Anarch deck that runs 3x Hippo, 2x Endurance, and then also 3. Like, there's a reason people really value consistency. And I've seen like people post like, oh, this like look, I can play this totally reasonable econ engine. And I'm like, yes, every card is each of these econ pieces is in a good deck, but no good deck runs this many different like econ triggers and draw triggers because you want they all are asking different things of you as your like game flow and as your deck construction. And so it's always going to be a little incoherent when you put all these different things together.
So I think the one, like, I don't know if it's a downside exactly or to Nova, and it's the same thing with Ampere to some extent, but it feels worse for the runner. It's like, you know, the games where on turn one, Nova produces the endurance or you get diversion because you don't ice up HQ. It's not like you should ice HQ against Nova every single game, right? Like, with the chance of a diversion existing there is not that likely. 40 cards, maybe it is. But yeah, I don't know. I feel like it's just going to tilt some people as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things to me is Nova will teach you good court fundamentals. If you just keep playing against Nova, you will slowly learn like, okay, if I consistently do this sort of game pattern, this is my like generic game plan against any runner, and then I can start learning my deviations because Nova's not going to be able to exploit you in the same way that like some other runners will. Will kind of be like the generic average exploitation of just a average runner across all threats, which I think is really cool.
Yeah, it's the archetypal Netrunner deck. Like a Stargate will happen at some point. Just you wait. So yeah, you have to prepare for that. When it's happening is going to be a different question. But yeah, I don't know. Way better than Ampere. Is that a tier? Do we have better than Ampere tier?
I think that's the whole thing.
I don't know. I feel like this is an archetype. Like I'm actually kind of hot on Nova. I think Nova's a bit better than I think it is. I don't think Nova is the best, but I don't think Nova is niche. And I think a big part of that is I think people are going to enjoy Nova.
Okay.
It kind of breaks our
Nova
list.
top of niche, but yeah, no, I just like Ampere broke our list. I think Nova breaks our list, but in a different spot. So
if I put Nova down here, we don't have to move our cameras. Like that's the best thing here, which I think is going to upset the Nova fans, but at least there's some logic to it. All right.
Well, okay. Just to appease the Nova fans for a second.
Yeah.
It might be better than tunnel vision. Or they might be better than tunnel vision.
Ooh, I'm in on this. Okay, hold on. I now need to move our cameras. 1 second. All right, cameras moved. It's our last card of the set. This Matryoshka. It's technically with a 6 of the consumer grade. They were classically called back in the day. It's a neutral AI icebreaker. Those are always really fun. Takes up 2 MU. Just about, I think all the AI icebreakers we saw in the set do. As a click, you can host a copy of Matryoshka from your grip face up on this program. It's not installed. You don't have to pay the cost, right?
Nope.
Lovely. Interface, spend X credits and turn 1 hosted copy of Matryoshka face down to break X subroutines. So this card on its own does nothing. You need the second Matryoshka for it to actually be able to break anything. It's 1-for-1 strength. It comes at a 2 strength of the base. And I forgot to mention, when your turn begins, you turn each hosted card face up. So the most of these you can play is 1 Matryoshka with 5 other nested Russian dolls within it, which means you can break 5 ice a turn. It also doesn't care what subtypes it's breaking, barrier, code gate, sentry, none. It can get through all of that, and it doesn't do it that poorly. Like 1-per-1 subroutine flat is fantastic. 2-for-1 strength is okay, not bad, but okay. But the question is
1-for-1 strength.
Sorry, 1-for-1 strength starting at 2. Excuse me. Yeah. That's not bad at all. Like that's what you expect. This is like the Corroder standard that cards used to be compared to back in the day. Things are different now, but as a neutral breaker, this is very weird because the sort of decks that want to play this are decks that are running maybe 1 powerful run a turn, which is there's a lot of decks that fall into the camp, but you need like a ridiculous amount of card draw to get this to be reasonable. With 6 of, I don't know what the math is of how often you'll have 2 in your opening hand. It's probably not uncommon, especially after you've drawn like 3 or 4 cards. You're almost very likely to have at least 2, which makes it functional. You are spending 2 clicks on that. It's strange. I don't know who plays this. Like, I think I've heard like Tag Me criminals play this and they have mass card draw, but that seems a bit clumsy. A lot of those decks are playing Mayfly because they just need to get 1 or 2 good runs off. If this thing gets trashed, like you've lost the game. Like you just lose the game, really, if this gets trashed.
Yeah.
Nothing to it.
Because you nerd snipe here, in your opening hand, if you're running all 6 copies in a 45 card deck, you've got about a 12% chance of seeing 2 of them.
That's worse than I thought it'd be, but like that's okay.
Yeah, by the time you're 10 cards in, you're going to see 40% of the time you're going to see 2 of them. So that's actually not fantastic.
Yeah, that's not that
good. It's going to be slow to ramp up for sure. Yeah, so maybe you can cheat out, like if you can use an SMC or a gachapon to get one down, like to get the first one down, and then you just play the ones from hand that way or something. I don't
And
know.
that's a big point too, is like if you're tutoring for other copies of this using the standard methods, like mutual favor still works, but self-modifying code doesn't work. Gachapon doesn't really work because you need to host them from hand. So you can't like cabinessa these out. Like you actually have to draw. You have to draw into the additional copies of this. And if they're at the bottom of your deck, like it's cool. You don't have a functional breaker.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I mean it's interesting because like corroder numbers on an AI breaker is
Yeah,
like a little like those are
that's good.
a little scary almost to some extent. And so it's like, yeah, it's the whole balance of this is how clunky it is to draw extra copies, and then how much like targeted program trashing the corp can do. Because I think it's not like a lot of decks can be like, yeah, I'm only going to be able to break 3 ice a turn for the mid game, but that's
That's fine.
probably as many ices I was going to break anyway.
Yeah,
Uh,
that's like really not that different than what you'd expect, barring like maybe some aggressive Amakua decks, which I don't think this makes a lot of sense in those decks.
yeah, yeah, but so I think it's we're probably like this. This is another card that wants a game day style payoff, right? Where you can
Yes.
like dump out your hand, draw half your deck, and then suddenly you're online really quickly. So maybe this is I think this is not quite an eternal card, but like it's that kind of environment where like we've got some different kind of sillier effects than we have in standard at the moment.
I think possibly one of the most playable ways to get this down is there's a card, I forget the name, excuse me, from Adam that allows you to draw 2 cards for every card you've trashed if you trash directives.
Hmm.
So even on turn 1, you can like mass draw, I think it's like 6+ cards if you really want
Yeah.
to rip your board apart, which means like you're kind of in a good spot. Obviously, your directives are good. Maybe you play more directives. Maybe that makes everything convoluted. But I think that's the biggest card draw on a single card. Maybe Nuka is just good enough to get you most of the way.
Yeah, maybe this is a decent Atom card where you just, like an Endurance Atom deck that just plays this as the AI breaker, and then Endurance and some Femme Fatales. Like maybe that's a deck. I don't know. It's
I think
influence free, so it's nice for the neutrals.
it's this card and then Poison Vial, and you play Always Be Running, and then you're set up with the Zenith chip, right? That's your modern Atom or whatever. It's probably
Yeah,
okay,
yeah.
honestly.
Yeah, and hey, we were talking about Apex needs a payoff. Maybe Apex can play this a little bit because they've, churned through stuff with the World Tree. You got Reaver to do some drawing on your way, and then you get your Matryoshkas out.
Yeah, it's strange because we talk about mini factions, and that's like the big thing is like every faction right now has reasonable ways to deal with ice. Like obviously endurance is one thing, but nobody's struggling to deal with ice. So I think mini factions are generally a pretty good idea with this. I don't think you want to play this in Sunny because you have 50 cards. Obviously you can't. Well, you can play this in Nova. Don't play this in Nova. Worst card you could add to your deck. But yeah. So
I need to
like
like go on a public. I should either edit my video or go on a public apology tour about like this might work well in the neutral runner.
you knew what you were doing. Yeah, that's really funny.
I a little bit.
Yeah, yeah. No, I respect that. It's also worth noting that there's 6 copies of this and they all have different flavor text. So we were considering ranking these based off of flavor text. This is the only graphic I have though. So they're all going to be on this one. What are you thinking?
Yeah.
I think this is like pretty niche. Like I don't think there's a deck right now that loves this, but it's like one of those cards that's really fun and I'm glad it's in the game.
Yeah, no, I expect to see the jank players in my meta be playing some Matryoshka because I think it's got some really high payoffs, but
Yeah.
it's definitely niche to me.
Yeah. I'm putting around there maybe.
Yeah, I think I could maybe go all the way to the right. I expect we're going to see Numb before we see Matryoshka in competitive play. We'll
Yep.
probably see more Matryoshka in casual meetups, but
Heck yeah.
in a tier list ranking, I think probably more Numb.
Cool. And so far, okay, before we give closing statements, Jeff, we'll take a second to see whether we misevaluated anything here or whether we want to move things because obviously things get added. Bammy, please, that seems
Yeah.
fine. Staples, I
Yep.
think, seem pretty good. I think I'm the highest on
Yeah.
Tremolo, but I'll take that one. Archetype role
Yeah, I
player,
don't even think it's that far off. So
cool, okay. Katorga is the big question mark here. There's like, it's like obviously very, very good. I don't know whether Anga is
yeah,
actually going to see more play than some of the cards to the right of it, but
yeah, yeah. I think Enga looks a little bit
understood.
overhyped here. I think it could probably go to the left of Flux. I think we're going to see more of it than Flux.
Okay, cool.
It's kind of my sense.
I think
But
potentially Ouse Moon is like massively undervalued, just the consistency of it. I think it's also
yeah,
kind of a
yeah,
boring card, which is not helping our evaluation of it, but like fundamentally it does something very good. And then
yeah.
Niche is fine.
Yeah, I'm not as high on Spark, but I think that's okay. I think I play Hush before any of the cards to the right of it. So if you really want Spark to the left, I think that's fine.
Cool. Okay.
I don't know.
Awesome.
What do you think is better than Hush here? Or better than
I think Poison Vial, Hippocampic are both going to see more play than Hush directly.
Okay. I think that's fine then. I feel like Hush has more payoff than Hippocampic, though. Turning off a border control seems like... Okay. I don't know.
That's a sort of confidence to end the video on, huh? On that note.
Oh, I thought this was all getting cut, so I could be whatever. I didn't have to be my character. I could just be...
Awesome. So I think that's it. We changed a bit. I think the bottom got shuffled a bit, and Enga slid down a bit. But I think we're largely there. Of course, this is the definitive tier list of what things look like. Again, this has been out for like 5 days or so I haven't even had time to play with all the cards. But like, I'm saying this not to say certain cards shouldn't be played. Like, that's not the point of we're doing this. The point of doing this largely is to have some discussions, and that's a huge part. Let us know in the comments below what you agree with, what you disagree with. Again, sometimes it's just like 1 or 2 card interactions that are just misevaluated or like unconsidered that can catapult something from the bottom to the top. So love to hear that. But I think a big part of this is just kind of hearing the conversation of how people evaluate and how people maybe look at competitive Netrunner, like what's important, what's valued. And it's so exciting to see these new cards. Again, we have no shames in this set, which is on the runner side, which is absolutely fantastic. And at the end of the day, while this is just about standard competitive play, I'm very excited we have all these cards, and I'll definitely be trying all of them out. And they all do something generally pretty interesting, which is a huge, it's a very big success for the set.
Yeah, I think this is some of the hardest set of runner cards to evaluate I think I've ever looked at in a pack of cards that since like way back. So I'm really excited to see where people disagree with us, where the meta actually shakes out. But yeah, I don't know. This has been a lot of fun, and I hope people enjoy the discussion.
And on that note, if you want to see the corp side of stuff, that's on Jeff's channel. That should already be up. So if you want to follow the link below, it'll take you there. Enjoy that. Like that video, subscribe to that channel. Same goes for here. And hopefully in a month, in 2023, when we come back from the new year after maybe some tournaments, we'll maybe sit down and reevaluate both of the tier lists on a bit of a quicker pace to see about where we hit, where we miss, and then what's kind of arised and why we were incorrect or correct, and largely just very correct about these things.
Yeah, for sure. And I suspect we're going to be off by just about 0 cards. So
that's good. We'll gloat. On that note, thanks so much for watching. I know these are a long one, but Parhelion's a great set. I hope you enjoy your time with it so far. Jeff, once again, thanks so much for joining me.
Hey, thanks so much. It's been a lot of fun.
And we'll catch you around. Hey, thanks so much for watching. And of course, if you want to see part 1 of this video series going over the corp cards from Parhelion, that's all on YsengrinSC. That's on Jeff's channel. The link will be below. If you want to go over there, leave a nice comment, like and subscribe. That would greatly please Jeff, I reckon. And speaking of tier lists, if you want to make your own, the template we used today from tiermaker.com, that was made by Ätsch, who shared that on the Green Level Clearance Discord. So if you want to take your own shot at this and show what you think the Parhelion meta might look like, please share it with us. We'd love to see it. Specifically also, if you want to make a startup tier list, I think that's a really fascinating question right now. Startup is a very interesting place with the rotation. And speaking of tier list, all these names here, ban me please. These are some of the kind folks who help support me and the Métropole Grid on Patreon. I really appreciate your support, and of course, to all the Daily Cast patrons, all your contributions help me put more time to make videos like this. Thanks so much. Again, we're off on holidays just about now if you're watching this, but we have another video queued up for Thursday, which we're trying out some of the new cards, specifically Banar, and let me tell you, Banar is quite good. See you in a bit, and happy holidays. Ciao.